Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of the Love Bomb Chats. I am joined tonight by Jimmy Nuts from the Fantasy Network. And Love Bomb Chats are basically my way of saying F you to everything terrible that's going on in the world. And we just talk about stuff that we really love and enjoy. And in this case, Jimmy and I had a conversation on Jimmy's channel a few weeks ago, which was super fun. And we started talking about our mutual love of A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as other things. So I figure we'll start with some of those. But how are you, Jimmy?
I'm okay. I've been in just a grouchy mood for like the last 3 days, and
Yeah.
I was talking to my friend Kev, who's actually in the chat, and I think it's because I've been playing Call of Duty more. I think it
Oh,
actually has an effect on people's mental health,
it's
and it just makes me
possible.
aggressive.
I
Yeah.
don't blame you. I have been playing the it's called Season of Discovery for World of Warcraft.
Okay.
And what it is they decided to release a version of the classic game with all of the stuff that they had intended to put in the game, but then decided not to last minute for some reason or another.
Hmm.
And it is so fun, and the PvP is already so frustrating. So I get
Well, it
it
feels like
because
if it wasn't put in the game, it's probably for a reason, right?
I don't know, because some of the stuff, it's more talent builds than anything else that they've kind of
Hmm.
changed. Hey, Matt. And it's been really fun to play with, but also hilarious to look at because you'll see a warlock tank running around and you're like, well, that looks ridiculous. But I enjoy it nonetheless because I'm just a hardcore WoW stan, but it's been fun either way, but also frustrating. So I get
Yeah, I
it.
avoid WoW because I know I can't do that again. Like I just can't, or like everything I do will cease. I mean, it's kind of like many of the other games that I'm slightly addicted to. Like I know my weaknesses at this point, and
Mhm.
I'm disappointed in myself that I've even slipped back into Call of Duty, but it is what it is.
Do you typically play games regularly?
I don't know if regularly would be the way to put it. Like right now, yeah, but like in general, no. I'm usually like a mood guy. I treat it a lot like television shows, where like I kind of go in and out with my interest in them, and it's like there's
Mhm.
just parts of the year where I'm like, ooh, I really want to do this. So for instance, like Baldur's Gate 3 is probably the best game I've ever played, probably my favorite game of all time, and I played 40 hours of it, and then I stopped cold turkey because I was like, all right, I'm not in the mood for this anymore. And I'm
Mhm.
okay. I will drop a game for like a year or 2 years and
Okay.
come back to it because
Okay.
it doesn't bother me that
Yeah.
much. So I go through spurts,
I
of
get that.
playing
I
stuff.
took probably a year off from WoW and then jumped back in, but WoW has been my constant game other than Mario Kart or something like that for the last however I played the original Nintendo and my family owned every single Nintendo, so I just keep going back for that. But I mean, the stakes aren't quite that high with Mario Kart.
I don't
So
know. Mario Kart has been a point of contention in many of my relationships because you're like, oh, we'll play Mario Kart. That's a fun. And then by the end of it, I'm like, raging at significant other. And Kev, you are correct. I will say the thing I really like about Call it. I don't play a lot of multiplayer games anymore.
Mhm.
But being able to hang out with like Bees, Kevin, and Garrick, like friends, and spending that time, like I've actually been looking for because I've just had like kind of a cruddy week. I've literally been looking forward to those
Yeah.
times where the game is almost secondary,
Yeah.
and
It's friend
it's
time.
weird. It's weird because I think BookTube has replaced that camaraderie in a lot of ways for me.
Sure.
Because I used to play a ton of games, like a ton of
Yeah.
multiplayer games, and it was my social hour. I mean, it was kind of how I interacted because I worked from home,
Mhm.
and I also did online school, so I was always on the computer. And when those people are only a message away, and you can boot up a
Yeah.
game at any time, it was just nice. But I do think that like the book sphere and interacting with people has kind of like replaced that in some ways.
I was talking to Tori about that last night and just saying how the booktube community is generally such a nice community. And it's been a great way to meet people. And that has become a lot of my social outlets because of the fact that I was telling you off screen, I live in a really rural area and I moved here during COVID. So I haven't gone out and made a bunch of friends. So it's nice to be like, oh, I can have conversations with people and not really have to leave my house, but still super enjoy that.
You know what I like about book people is that it seems to be that we're all oversharers in some way, or like we're not afraid to show it. Like this show is literally like you're hosting it so that we can gush about things.
Yeah.
And I just feel like the passion, some people are a little more reserved, but you can get almost anybody. You hit on
Mhm.
just that right thing, like Ice Planet Barbarians or something, and they're like, they jump at you. And for instance, today, I was working out. I was doing this exercise, and this guy came up to me and he's like, "Hey man, what does that hit? Is that like your shoulders or I'm like, "Oh, it's my triceps." And I literally take off my headphones and I just start vomiting information at him. I'm like, you really need to put the attention on the hypertrophic movement, which is the eccentric part of the move. And he's just like, "Oh, I just wanted to know what it was." And I was like, "Ah, I'm weird.
Yeah. We can't
I'm
be
a
best
weirdo."
friends now, really? Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely am that person too. The second I see someone glom onto something that I also like, I look at them and zone in and think, you and I are going to have a conversation about this, whether or not you are ready for this conversation. It's coming. My husband and I went to Barnes and Noble a few weeks ago, and this girl was wandering around the fantasy section aimlessly. And I looked at her and I saw what she was carrying. And I was like, I really don't want you to read that. Please read these things instead. Didn't say that to her, but was like, if you're interested in fantasy, let me tell you about blah, 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 blah. And this poor girl was like, I just saw this book on Book Talk and thought it looked interesting. I was like, you have a great night now. I've just like yammered at you for the last 5 minutes.
Was it Fourth Wing?
It was Fourth Wing, and she had Iron Flame in the same pile. And I was looking at my husband. I was like, I just can't. Like, I I never want to shame people for what they're reading, because I'm like, you're reading. Good for you for making the choice to read books. But simultaneously, there's that little sliver in your heart that's like, read what I want you to read. You
Well, yeah,
know?
we all want people to read like what we want to read, but the interesting thing about Fourth Wing is that I think a lot of people are going to that book for the romance part of it, which is excellent, and it opens up that gateway to
Mhm.
entering fantasy.
Yes.
I kind of talked this on Chatting with Nuts, but like people I went to high school with that like definitely would make fun of me for running a fantasy booktube channel,
Mhm.
or snicker about it,
Yeah.
or reading Fourth Wing. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, who knows? Maybe the next post they'll be carrying the Hobbit or what, whatever, enter whatever that would be, right?
Exactly.
Or
It's the
Sun Eater.
gateway drug.
Yeah, yeah, and that's cool. And also, um, if it is just for the romance, that's cool too. I mean, you really
Yep.
can't undersell how popular romance is. Like it's literally
It's
keeping
such a big
bookstores in business.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, romantasy has become, I mean, Goodreads had its own category for it, right? For their
Mhm.
awards this year, romantasy, which it's not for me personally, if that's not abundantly clear by my opinions on this. But I get that people really like that. And a lot of booktubers lean heavily into romantasy, and that works for them. And there's definitely a more developed and fleshed out market of that now than there was even a few years ago, because I think
Yeah.
they're realizing there is such a large market for it.
Well, and also you have to think about the fact that like representation is a lot more broad now in romance than what it used to be. And I
Mhm.
think that a lot of people can kind of reintegrate into like a love life through that. And I'm not saying all of them don't have toxic relationship, whatever, you know what I mean? I know
Sure.
there's some bad examples.
Yes.
Um, but like a lot of like I don't know, I think most people are a little bit lonely and maybe feel a little bit awkward, and
Mhm.
maybe that helps bring that wall down a little bit. And I think
Yeah.
that actually has like a really big place. So I don't read a romance really, but I'm always a pretty staunch defender of it because there's
Yeah.
something people are getting out of it. Whenever
Oh,
I talk
absolutely.
about Malazan making me maybe a better person, I'm sure that sounds nutty, no pun intended. But it's there. There's something to get out of it. So I just feel like I feel like I got to give romantasy a shot soon. It's got to happen.
So, Kevin, this is also my favorite romantasy is Warbreaker, because I love Warbreaker so much. I know that you love Stormlight Archive and you've
Mhm.
had a few hit or misses with other Sanderson books. Is Warbreaker on that list
I like
of
Warbreaker.
misses? Okay, did you?
I like Warbreaker though. The longer I got away from it, the more I've
Okay,
liked it. And
interesting.
I would be curious how I feel on a reread. But out of
Yeah.
all the Sanderson's works, there's a few that feel different. And
Yes.
I would say that Emperor's Soul feels different. Warbreaker feels pretty different. And then a lot of Stormlight felt different. Maybe not so much with Rhythm of War. But
That's where I'm at right now.
I hope you
Yeah.
like science.
Yeah.
It's Brandon Sanderson, the science guy, for
Yeah.
that. But I mean, but I did like Warbreaker. In
Yeah.
fact, whenever I heard that Sanderson's going to do a Warbreaker too, I was pretty excited. Like I was like,
Yeah.
finally, there's something other than Stormlight for me to get really hyped about. Um, that's just one of those authors. Like I will do my damnedest to enjoy things he does because he does
Yeah.
so much.
He is pretty unstoppable. And I was talking to my husband about this because I just started reading him last year, that my expectation is now 4 or 5 books a year. So when we go to just
Well, that's
one book,
ridiculous.
yeah, I was like, this has been such an amazing year for me coming into Sanderson because I just kept getting all of these great books. And now I'm looking at it going, 1 book a year. What do you get it together, Brandon? Come on.
I'm over here like, please publish one book every 12 years, like George.
Right? Or before you die, George R. R. Martin, please publish one more
Please
book.
give us one more wild cards. I beg of you.
Exactly. So we talked a little bit about a gateway book into fantasy. Did you have a gateway book, or was it kind of just out of the gate, you really liked fantasy?
I mean, it would have to have been, the typical white dude answer of Lord of the Rings. Like, I feel like,
Yes.
I don't even have to say. You just know. You just look at me and be like, dark rim glasses and a Targaryen shirt. This dude is struggling through Fellowship at 11. uh, there was something about the epicness of fantasy that always kind of drew me into it. And
Mhm.
I also liked other fantasy stuff as a kid too. This is one I don't know if I've ever really talked about, but I really liked He-Man when I was a kid. I really liked,
Awesome.
yeah, and Skeletor. Like I thought that stuff was
Amazing.
like next level, and
Love Skeletor.
I don't remember diddly squat from any of it, but
Well, that's
I had
concussion
an
talk right
affection.
there, Jimmy.
I mean, I had an affinity for that whenever I was a kid, and other things that I'm sure have like escaped my mind. But it seemed like I always kind of leaned that way. Even some of the YA sports books that I was really obsessed with had somewhat fantastical elements. Like the Devil's Wager was definitely in one of them. Um, Elantris is one I'm going to retry because I think the world and the premise is so cool.
So cool.
I just got to get over it.
So I've read a bunch of stuff of Sanderson this year. Obviously, I've talked ad nauseum about it, but I really liked Elantris. I actually gave it 5 stars, which is not a popular opinion because of how much I liked the world. I liked the world so much. I thought the concept was
Nerd.
so interesting. I know. And I think because in part it has been so present in the Cosmere, which was surprising to me based on the fact that everyone was like, it's a standalone. I didn't expect as
Mhm.
many Elantris references, but I super enjoyed it. And Rathan, the priest in that book, I will argue is one of the best Cosmere characters. He's
Okay.
super, super interesting. So I'd be interested when you reread it, what you end up thinking of it.
Yeah, I struggled with the audiobook because I did it on audio, and
Oh,
I struggled with the audiobook, and the dialogue just didn't really mesh with me. I'm a big dialogue person. Like
yeah,
basically, you can get me through a pretty subpar novel with some great dialogue. I'm most likely gonna love it.
yeah.
Um, and I felt like that was what Elantris for me was lacking. But I do think that the world building in it and the setting, all of that is very interesting, and the
Mhm.
history of the area that we're in.
Yeah.
So I want to give it another shot, and it is a big part of the Cosmere, so I feel
It
like I have.
is.
My God,
It is a big part of the Cosmere, but your favorite part of the Cosmere, I assume, is Stormlight, correct? And
yeah,
then you
it's
have
not
a
even
podcast
close.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's funny because I have a podcast that's about Stormlight, but I constantly get hate mail about how I don't know enough about the Cosmere, and
Really?
yeah, oh, literally the people mail very frequently trying to get me replaced on the show, which is really funny to me. I think it's hilarious.
Oh my gosh. People need better things to do, really.
Listen, all I want to do is from that show, all I want to do is get invited to the Sanderson mansion, and I want to stay in the Elantris suite, and I want to wet the bed. Like, that is
Right?
my entire goal. I want to
I
wet
mean,
the
it's
bed
not a
in
bad
the
goal.
Elantris suite.
It is not a bad goal. I mean, the fact that he has an Elantris suite is pretty miraculous.
Could you imagine I come out with like a shamed look on my face, like, Mr. Sanderson, I wet the bed, and then he has to do a Sanderson update, like, yeah, we had a couple of people come over to the mansion and they ruined the sheets. It'd be so
Yeah,
fun.
it would be delightful. Oh my gosh, that would yeah, I would be here for that. So, how did your podcast come about for the Stormlight Archive?
Well, me and Christian have talked about doing stuff for the last 4 years together. Like, we've always just tried to come up with something. And so Christian started out, with bigger production stuff, and a lot of it was around the Stormlight Archive. And he is
Mhm.
I always said he's like the Alt Shift X or the Quinn Ideas of Stormlight. And Christian
Yeah,
is phenomenal, by the way. He
he is
worked as a
great. Yeah.
photographer. Like, he understands editing and all this stuff that I don't
Mhm.
understand.
His
Um,
videos are great.
yeah, he's fantastic. And I think that we probably would have done something sooner, but he had this time period where he didn't know what he was. And then he started doing kind of general booktube content and realized very quickly that wasn't what he wanted to do. He's not someone that
Yeah.
wants to read 80 books a year or 30 books a year. He likes to dig in to whatever
Mhm.
he's really enjoying. So it was just one of those things where like our worlds weren't crossing, but with Stormlight 5 coming out,
Yeah.
um, you know, he's like, I really think this is a good idea. And he does a lot of work on that show, so I have to give him almost all the I just show up and kind of talk, and sometimes I upload episodes because
Right.
that's the bandwidth that I have.
Yeah.
So he's very much the driver on that show. But we've always wanted to do something together. We've talked about actually I've talked about him about First Law more than anybody else, but we've never done it really on camera. I guess we did do a
Oh,
First Law
really?
video together back in the day, but
Okay.
like we have probably talked 40 hours of First Law stuff. So he's just one of those guys, and we were there for each other through some pretty tough times, like of just like isolation and stuff. And
Yeah.
he's a really good friend of mine.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, were you hooked on Stormlight from the get-go
Yeah.
with Way of Kings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Almost hyperbolically. So I kind of cringe a little bit at the review I did of Way of Kings because I was losing my mind during the review, and I hadn't read a ton of stuff. But I was saying like this is up there with like Tolkien. I said a lot of
Mhm.
things that maybe were hyperbolic, but they were true to the experience that I had with the book when I read it. I mean, I genuinely loved it.
That's
I don't
awesome.
think it's the best review in the world, and it has like 40,000 views, and I'm like, why? Like, why does it have to be this one? Um,
Uh,
but it saved Sanderson for me because I read Mistborn and was very whelmed, and
that's
uh,
fair.
I was worried. And I had those Stormlight books; I had already bought them, and they were
That was the
sitting
same
there,
with me.
and they're so, and just the name sounds cool. You want to be a part of like the really big epic fantasy that's going on right now.
Yeah.
Like, you know, name another show in town that's active. Like,
Yeah.
there's not much. So I wanted to give it a fair shot, and I was really worried. I kind of went into it expecting to hate it, and I read it while I was moving, and I read it very slowly, and I just had a blast. I mean, it was so much fun.
Awesome.
And I read them all right in a row, and I think that ended up hurting Rhythm of War a little bit. I think maybe if I
Mhm.
had taken maybe 6 months and came back to it, I think I would have liked it a little bit more. And that's not just a Stormlight thing, but also
Yeah.
with other series. Like I took a really long break between Republic of Thieves and Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. And I know a
Mhm.
lot of people are a little bit down on that third book, but I'm on like
Yeah.
65% of the way through, and I'm really enjoying it. Probably
Oh, that's
because I'm
cool.
not comparing it to the other ones, but
Right.
I was ready for more Lynch, and then I came back. When I got to Rhythm of War, I was pretty gassed out. Like I was Sandersoned
That's
out.
that's interesting because that's kind of where I'm at right now, but I also love this Midborn. I think that's a great name. I read Way of Kings in February or March. I think I started it in February and I finished it in March.
Nice.
And I did not have the same experience as you reading Way of Kings. I was not as enamored, but I had just read Warbreaker and I loved Warbreaker. And I think in my mind, I had a set idea now because I had read Mistborn, Elantris, and Warbreaker back to back, basically, and then jumped right into Way of Kings and was like, this is nothing like the last few books that I've read. Not sure I'm digging this vibe all that much, but really liked some of the characters in the story. And I really got on board with Bridge 4 pretty much immediately. I was like, I like these characters. I'm interested to see where this goes, but I'm not. needing to dive into this immediately, and
Mhm.
then waited until October, I think it was, or September, to pick up Words of Radiance. And it was fire. So good. The whole book from start to finish was fantastic. Like one of the best fantasy books I've ever read. So, so good.
Yeah, one of the easiest books I've ever read because, like, it
Yeah.
simply kinda just wanted me to read it, and so I
Yep.
did. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, I don't know. I'm rereading Way of Kings right now. We're doing it very slowly, and I see things that bother me now that probably wouldn't have bothered me back then, but a lot of my experience is just remembering, like, the feeling of getting back into, like, a big fantasy world, and
Yeah.
I can't wait to read Words of Radiance again. I mean, that is one of my favorite reading experiences, ever, probably.
It was similar like that for me, but before I get to that, I hope that you like it, Philip. I actually really loved Oathbringer. So I seem to be in a slight minority for that as well, that I like Oathbringer way more than I liked Way of Kings. But I feel like in part that's also now because I'm committed to the characters and I'm invested with them. And I love Dalinar. I think Dalinar is amazing. So I really enjoyed Oathbringer for that reason. But when reading Words of Radiance, my husband has zero context for Stormlight Archive. The only Sanderson he's read is some of the Wheel of Time books, and he wasn't super crazy about how Sanderson ended them. So he's had no desire to go back and read him. I needed to talk at someone when I read the duel scene in Words of Radiance and sat in front of my husband, was like, this is what just happened, and gave him all of this context for like half an hour. And he's just sitting there nodding and was like, well, I'm glad you enjoyed that. And I was like, are you for real? Like, that's all I get. Like, I was like, this is one of the greatest scenes ever written in fantasy. And the end of the scene is like horrifying. And all I get is, yeah, glad you enjoyed that.
I mean, whenever you're not into it, right? It's like whenever I try to explain mixed martial arts to people, they're just
Yeah.
they have no idea what I'm talking about, and I'm thrilled, and then they are just confused and slightly concerned for me.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah, it is. But when you find people like on BookTube or your community of people that you can share that with, it ends up being way more fun, because I then ended up bombarding a few people that I've met through BookTube, and I was like, I need to tell you all of my feelings that I am experiencing in this moment, because I literally cannot contain them. I just got overwhelmed with excitement when reading that book. I absolutely adored it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great thing about having a YouTube channel, is that you can come in and scream at the camera whenever you want to do that kind of thing. There's only been a couple books that have gotten me like out of breath while talking about them, and I think Words of Radiance is definitely up there, and like Wall of Storms and the Dandelion Dynasty is the last. I guess the last one I remember on the channel, that really like I was like, I gotta go turn the camera on right now. There might have
Mhm.
been another one since then, but yeah, those books are special.
That's awesome. So you said also that you really like First Law, which we didn't really talk a whole lot about
Mhm.
in our conversation. So I've only read the First Law trilogy. Have you read
Yeah,
everything?
I've read everything, except for this new short story collection that
Yeah.
just came out. I own it. I just haven't read it yet.
And which trilogy would you say you prefer, First Law or Age of Madness?
Oh, it's so tough. I mean, I think Age of Madness is a better trilogy, but there's so much about the first trilogy that like is, iconic in my
Mhm.
opinion.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are flaws in it, but I don't care about those flaws all that much. And there's some things in there that were done that he when he did it, I was like, wow, he's really going to do this thing like that. He's going to piss off a lot of people. And
Yeah.
reading it like that, I had a really great time with it. But I really feel like Age of Madness is kind of incredible. I actually I messaged Bookborn today and remarked about how a character literally changes so much while still being the same person. Like
Mm.
the situation changes, so there's character growth, but like at the end of the day, they kind of, because he's a very circular writer. Like a lot of
Yeah.
stuff comes full circle, but there is growth in that circle. It just
Mhm.
so happens that they arrive back at the same point. I think there's a lot of really great stuff in Age of Madness, and it's kind of hard to say that it isn't the best thing he's done, I think.
I'm excited to read it. I haven't read it yet. I breezed through First Law, absolutely loved it. And then picked up Best Served Cold. And I've been in the middle of Best Served Cold for like 6 months. Just because
That's a polarizing one. Yeah.
yeah, life has gotten in the way. And I found that the way Monza is written was just kind of not as dramatic of a pharaoh for me. And I was like,
Hmm.
like I'm not as into this, but I really liked some of the other characters, like getting to know Shivers better and things like
Shivers.
that.
Shivers is one of the most underrated characters in
He's
fantasy.
great.
No one,
He's
no one,
so
when we
great.
see these top 10 lists, I don't see Shivers on there, but
He
whew,
should be.
he's
But when
great.
it comes to the original trilogy, are you Team Glocta as your favorite character of that, or is it somebody else like Giselle?
Well, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I like all of the characters. Like, I can
Okay.
agree that Pharaoh is a fairly straightforward character, and
Yeah.
she sticks out like a sore thumb because of that. But I don't even mind Pharaoh all that
I
much, to be
didn't
honest.
either. I liked Pharaoh by the end. I know a lot of people, she's not for them, but I actually I loved her in interactions with Logan. I thought that they were really enjoyable and funny, personally.
Yeah, I definitely think my favorite character is still probably Logan Nine Fingers. Like,
Really?
I really, there is a character that I might like more that's in the new trilogy, but
Okay.
I just love Logan Nine Fingers in a lot of ways because like it's just a dude trying to do his best for where he's at and like fighting this demon, like literally.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't know. There's something about that character that's it's iconic. And also the Bloody Nine is like one of the coolest nicknames. I put a lot of stock in names, by the way. Like if you
Yeah.
can name your
Great name.
characters or give them a cool a catchy name, I'm probably gonna like that. Um,
Yeah.
that's just
So,
something I gravitate towards.
what do you think the Bloody Nine is? Do you think it is a different state within him? Do you think it's a magical ability or property? What is the Bloody Nine in your opinion?
It almost feels like it's one thing at the beginning of the trilogy, and then Joe just never really mentions it again. So,
Yeah.
like, I mean, I think he's clearly troubled. And
Yeah.
whether that be by an external force or not, I don't know if you can really decipher that. I mean, it's a pretty good question. I've never heard anyone pose that question before. I just kind of always figured it was something he was kind of born with.
Hmm.
We don't get a lot of context for it though, which is
We
interesting.
don't. And I don't know if that bothers me or not because Joe has this really unique way of writing a story where you're not given a ton of information about the world in general. And you're like, that's fine.
Mhm.
Whereas where I feel another author would do something similar and you'd be reading it and expecting that information because his characters are so good. It doesn't matter as much to me as it possibly would in another story. I don't know.
No, yeah, it doesn't bother me at all because I think, and this is something I see. I feel like when I see people who read just like a lot of fantasy, is especially like epic fantasy, is that they feel like you have to check every box, and that's
Yeah.
not the truth. You can actually write a
Agreed.
story focusing on something that is completely different. I mean, the Blade itself is kind of set up like noir almost in some ways,
Mhm.
not exactly, but it's a very slow to get to the point type deal, and pieces are
Yeah,
coming together, people are coming together. Um, I think that's fine. Like, he
I do
set out
too.
to do that thing. I don't think if you asked Joe Abercrombie, like, "Did you build the greatest fantasy world of all time with the most depth?" He'd be like, "Hell no, I didn't do that.
Right.
That's not what I was doing."
Mhm.
Um, I think he very much is, commenting more on human nature, than
Yeah.
anything else. So, I think that's a perfectly fine thing to focus on, and I
Yeah,
still think
sure.
you can be a great piece of work without focusing on a magic system or, the most in-depth history of all time. It just depends on what you're setting out to do.
Yeah, I Joe kind of changed the way that I felt about that in general because my previous experience with fantasy was that exactly where you have that checklist and you're making your way through the book and going, have we hit that yet? Have we hit that? All right, it was good, maybe not as good as this book. And then I opened this, and the only thing I knew about First Law was people saying It's character driven and there's not a lot of plot. If that works for you, enjoy. And I was like, we'll see. And I got to the first Galacta chapter and was like, we're in, and was so immediately drawn to Galacta that I was like, he could just write the whole book about Galacta walking up or attempting to walk upstairs. And I would give this a 5 stars because it's phenomenal. And I was completely satisfied with everything we got in the first book, but really actually loved in the second book how you start getting those elements of the world, and really loved the way that he did it because you weren't being bombarded with it by almost history lessons like sometimes we get in other stories. I liked that it was a journey that they themselves were taking around the continent basically, and you were learning as Jazal was learning. That to me was such a fun way to go about it. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some subversions of tropes in the first trilogy that I still think about to this very day. There's a plot line in book 2 that is literally one of my favorite things I've ever read. And I know for a fact there's people out there who absolutely hate that plot point. And I'm just like, yeah, I love it.
I need to know what that is after if you don't want to give spoilers away.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone. I'll tell you afterwards. It's pretty
Yeah.
renowned as being like disappointing, but I loved it. So I like circular stories as well.
I do too.
Yeah.
I actually really love that. And I know that is a point of contention for people in his writing. And I think it's very apt to human nature that people kind of will come back to who they really are. So I like that he incorporates that into his story.
It's certainly a reality for some people. I mean, I think that I don't even know if there's an argument against that. Yeah, some people can change, but there are people who do the dance over and over and over. And people obviously can have their own taste and not enjoy that. But to say it's not a valid way of telling a story is incorrect. You know, it's obviously a way that you can go about it. And it's something that I do enjoy. So
me too. So you made a point of saying Joe would probably agree that he did not write the best fantasy world that ever exists. So is that for you A Song of Ice and Fire? Is that the best fantasy world that's ever been written and exists, or is there a different one?
Define best, right? Because
best.
if you're asking my favorite, it's not even close. It's Westeros all day long. Now, was I like breathless in the scope of what Malazan was? Without a doubt. Do I like getting lost in Roshar? Yeah, see, plug. Yes, I do. So, there's plenty of other worlds. I enjoyed my time at Buck Keep in Realm of the Elderlings, which is, for all intents and purposes, a pretty plain, mundane fantasy setting. I still enjoyed my time at Buck Keep as well. And then there's even some sci-fi books. Like I just read The Left Hand of Darkness. I mean, incredible. Just an incredible setting. But I think that Westeros is without a doubt my victor. I thought about this today because I knew we'd probably end up talking about it, and I was just thinking about like how invested I am in things that most people who have read the main series probably don't even know about or care about, having given a second thought to, right? The Doom of Valyria, Nymeria and the 10,000 Ships, these type of things.
Yes.
These are things I think about on a regular basis, and for me to take time out of my day when I'm usually just worrying about something, that's what I think about. I don't think about many other series that way.
So okay, let's start to dig in, because this is the crux of the meat of our conversation. So the Doom, we talked about this a little bit on the Chatting with Nuts episode that you graciously had me on, and I want to see the Doom so badly. I just want it. Like, of all the adaptations, it's the one that I want the most, Jimmy. I don't know if we're ever getting it.
The Faceless Men did that shit. There ain't no doubt that they did that. I was just reading over George's original outline for Feast for Crows got released. They got leaked, and I was reading over it, and some of the stuff that got omitted or changed is so interesting, and some of it might kind of tell a new tale around Death of Dragons and such things, which the Doom of Valyria very much was tied to. And like, I don't know. I think about this stuff all the time. I think about the stories that George hasn't even really told us. Like, can we get more about Yeti? Like, that would be fantastic. I would love to have that. I think it's the real sense of history. I think that is what draws me so much to A Song of Ice and Fire. I think
Right.
I also, like, I mean, it goes without saying, but like Middle Earth is also incredibly interesting. And I have not read the Silmarillion, and I know there's going to be like someone be like, "You haven't read the Silmarillion?" I'm kidding. I'll get to it. But I have watched so many videos from Men of the West and Nerd of the Rings and all these places that when they take pieces of the Silmarillion and
Yeah.
they paint these pictures, and you're just like, whoa, like
Yeah.
there's a real like sense of time passing.
Yeah.
And I think actually that George R. R. Martin does that really well as well. So
Mhm.
those are two things that I could just like kind of absorb. I might even like some of that stuff more than some of the actual text of Lord of the Rings, like the
Oh,
actual like
yeah.
book. Because I don't know, there's just something about like historical fantasy that I'm a fan of.
I love that too. And sometimes when Tolkien's on his third page of talking about a tree, you think this is a little bit less interesting than some of the information in the Silmarillion.
Yeah, the Blue
But
Wizards. Tell me more about that.
right. I agree though. I love when a world feels established and lived in. And George, I think of our modern authors, is probably the best that I've read that does that. And because it is heavily influenced by history, right? Like Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire is very much influenced by the War of the Roses. And those parallels are there and are super fascinating. But the fact is that this man went out and published a book, like a history book, as
Yeah.
as an additional novel to his series. Not many people do that.
Yeah, and I loved it. I know that other people didn't like it, but
I did.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Two other things I see some people saying in the chat is Urwa is another great world from the what's up, Colin? From the Second Apocalypse by R. Scott Baker. It is very in depth, has some really wacky stuff in it. But I was just having a conversation with some Okidu and Shelf Unstable yesterday. We recorded a conversation about Perdido Street Station, but the Baslag series by China Mieville has literally some of the coolest, most original world building you've ever seen. I mean, we're talking about moths that feed on human consciousness. Then there's someone above that like interacts with reality. I mean, really heady stuff, very metaphysical. I think the Baslag series is the most underrated as far as like popular series goes because
Huh.
it's critically acclaimed. But
Yeah.
like you don't see a lot of like diehard Baslag t-shirt wearers out there. But I think China
Mhm.
Mieville has an imagination that's just like unrivaled.
That's awesome. Yeah, I
Yeah.
hadn't heard of it until
Oh,
I've been
he's
seeing
incredible.
Britton mention it in the chat and then you mentioning it now. So yeah, I'd never heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, the second book in the series is The Scar, and it is definitely going to be my top 10 books of the year when I make that video. It'll
That's awesome.
probably I mean, it's definitely in contention for the best book I've read this year.
Wow.
China Mieville is absurd. Like he's absurdly good at writing.
That's
um,
awesome.
and like I said, like there are like ant people, and I've never been a big fan of like I don't know, like
Of
human
human ants.
animal hybrid things, but like
Mhm.
he he got it. Like he made it work for me.
Yeah.
Which is impressive because that's a bias that I have. And yeah, I just think that the Baslag is also like when I think of like Tolkien and George R. R. Martin or whoever else, like I always think of Baslag now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely gonna have to check it out then. I've been talking to Joanna about doing David Mitchell since you recommended him to me as a buddy read for next year.
Let's go.
And I didn't realize David Mitchell was that David Mitchell because I've watched the game show Would I Lie to You? And he's one of the two main staples on that show.
Wait,
And
is this the other David Mitchell though? There's
I
two
don't
David.
know. Is it the same person or not the same person?
I
Because
don't think it
I thought
is.
it was.
No, because
So,
there's a famous David Mitchell that is on like TV and movies or
and that's
whatever.
the one I thought it was, and I was
It's not him.
very confused. Okay.
Yes, this is very common. Very,
Yeah,
very
so
common.
it's the
Because
same.
the
All
other
right.
David Mitchell
Thank you.
also has written a book. I think it's a nonfiction book, but he's also written
Yeah.
a book. So it's a
That's why
mess.
I was so confused. I was like, this is not the person I would have thought Jimmy was recommending to me, but I'll take it because he's hilarious. And that's kind of where my research ended. So it's good to know that that is not, in fact, the same person.
No, I imagine one of them is much wealthier than the other. I had to
Probably.
guess.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think it's game show David Mitchell.
Yeah. I don't think Yeah, I don't think Utopia Avenue or Ghost Written has exactly popped off. I mean, Cloud Atlas did have a TV or a movie adaptation with Tom
Yes.
Hanks. And Tom Hanks said it's one of the only good movies he made. I think he said that he had 3 good movies he made, and that was one of them.
What? That's
Yeah, I think Tom Hanks is being a bit self-deprecating. He
a
had a
little
run in
bit
the
there.
90s that has ever been matched. I mean,
Yeah.
arguably.
I mean, it's pretty much him and Meryl Streep just making everything turn into gold. So I don't know what he's talking about.
I got beef with Meryl Streep. I don't like her.
Really?
Nope, don't like her. Not a
Why?
fan. She made this stupid speech when she won some stupid award where her friends gave her, and she goes, we need to save the arts because when the arts are not mixed and martial or something along those lines, like just randomly crapped on mixed martial arts for having arts in the name. And I was like, you know
Okay.
what? I don't like you.
I'm done with you, Meryl Streep. How dare
Yeah,
you?
yeah. See me in the streets. Catch these hands, Meryl Streep. She's a
Oh
big
my
fan of the
gosh.
channel.
You've got her, Jimmy's got T Swift. I mean, you guys are just pulling in, or Alan's got T Swift. You guys have just got all these famous people that are, showing up to support you.
Yeah, I'm humbled to be so influential.
It's a badge of honor that you should carry on. You should have a little plaque that you put next to Robert on your shelf there and say Meryl was here.
I mean, yeah, it's a responsibility, if I had to say. By the way, Key said Book of the New Sun. Yeah, I haven't finished Book of the New Sun, but like Book of the New Sun is one of the greatest works in sci-fi or fantasy. It's phenomenal. And I'm
I've
only in book
seen
3.
so many people really praise that book this year. So it's the TBR now is becoming an issue because I am a mood reader and I've been thinking about all the books I want to read and now I'm just getting
It's a
overwhelmed.
problem. It's a problem.
I'm like, where does one go from here?
Let me give you a secret. You just say, "Oh, I'm going to read that next year." And you just say that all the time.
Every year until you
Yeah, people who have been around my channel long enough, it's like a meme now. It's like, "Oh, Jimmy's going to read that next year. 2024. 2024 is going to be
exactly.
good."
That's so funny. So you don't love Meryl Streep, but is there a particular actor generally that you will watch anything that they're in or promote stuff that they're
Alan's
in?
gonna hate this. He's gonna hate this. I love Joaquin Phoenix. Though I haven't seen The Joker, and I haven't seen Napoleon yet, but I actually love Joaquin Phoenix. The first movie I ever saw him in was We Own the Night, which has a very raunchy opening scene with Eva Mendes. And I was just like, I was like 13. I was like, I'm in. This is sick. And I just loved his performance in that. And then I started watching his other stuff, and I really liked the movie Her, which was kind of weird.
It was weird.
I think he's just a great actor. I haven't watched Joker because like I'm not a big and I know it's a character study, blah 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 blah, but
Yeah.
I'm not big on like Batman and Superman and all that
That's
stuff.
fair.
So I just
Not
haven't got.
everybody.
I will watch it eventually because he has him in it.
Yeah.
And I actually was going to go see Napoleon, but I had IMAX tickets the night it came out, but my wife got COVID, so we didn't go. So
That's probably considerate of you guys not to go and infect everybody else in the small theater.
I haven't heard very good things, but like Ridley Scott's just one of those people that just does what he wants to do, and whether or
He
not
really
he's
does.
right, I
Yeah.
respect him. Like I love how grumpy he is.
Yeah. I could see you guys kind of sharing a similar vibe.
Philip says one of Joaquin's Phoenix cousins was a student of his.
Hey.
Wild.
The
Yeah,
closest I had to like family relations of a celebrity was that a kid I went to school with was the nephew of Celine Dion. And that's where I grew up. And everyone was very impressed with this because it was right around the time that Titanic came out and her song was everywhere for
I'll
a
say you
million
couldn't have
years.
got much bigger at that time, unless if you had Leo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's pretty cool. So Joaquin Phoenix. So you like Gladiator then? Like that's something
Yeah, Gladiator
you
was cool. Yeah. I mean,
this is this
I
is going
enjoyed
really
it.
well, Jimmy, until just now.
Well, I have terrible taste in movies. Don't like I have no qualms. Like my favorite movie of all time is most likely Friday with Chris Tucker and Ice Cube.
That's
Like
a
I'm not.
great movie.
Oh,
It's such a fun movie.
how the hell are you gonna get fired on your day off?
Exactly.
What were you doing
Oh,
stealing boxes? Trying to build a clubhouse? That's the
I
best way.
loved Friday.
I watched it so
I
many
will
times I
admit,
scratched the DVD.
have
It's
not
amazing.
watched it in probably 15 years, but greatly enjoyed Friday and
It's
its
the,
sequel.
it's the best stoner comedy for me. It's whew. And it's so memeable.
It is. There's so many good moments from that movie. That's
Oh
hilarious.
God, what a great movie. Bernie Mac, God rest his soul.
I miss Bernie Mac so much. I loved the Bernie Mac show. Oh man, so good.
When he gets chased out of the house by the little dude, it's like Miss Parker, Miss Parker.
See, we're not alone. Kyle also greatly enjoys Friday, so it seems that your taste in movies is not maybe the worst thing ever, other than Gladiator. But that's
Dark One's
fine.
Taint says he watched Friday and Dumb and Dumber on nonstop as a kid, literally on repeat. Yes. Every Monday, my best friend Andrew would come over. He stayed at my house after school. And we would watch Friday or Dumber and Dumber and Super Troopers. We watched a lot of Super Troopers.
Dumb and Dumber is a film that is quoted repeatedly in my family. So you're saying there's a chance is one of our top probably
yeah.
3 quotes that we use just over and over and over. It's so good. So those are your favorite movies potentially.
I have a lot of favorite movies, but
Yeah,
like
it's hard
those,
to pick just one.
but like sometimes you gotta like just level with yourself and be like, what did I enjoy the most?
Mhm.
You know, it's how is anything going to dethrone Friday? I've never watched another movie even close to as many times as that. It's like dethroning a Storm of Swords. It's not going to happen ever.
So is
Like,
that the favorite book then
oh
ever?
yeah, yeah, it's not close. I mean, there are times where other A Song of Ice and Fire books like supersede it on rereads and stuff. Like
Mm.
I really like Feast for Crows, and I know that's like
That is
liking
the
the last two.
controversial opinion.
Yeah, liking the last 2 books is like, I mean, you just enter these conversations and you just stare at these people like, yeah, I know you don't like them, whatever. But sometimes a book on a reread, I'll be like, oh, I kind of like that a little bit more. But like as an
Yeah.
experience and in my history with it, I mean, Storm of Swords, if I read all these other series that I have read, and by the way, love dearly,
Yeah.
and those weren't able to like recalibrate my mind, I doubt, I leave room to being wrong, but I doubt
Mhm.
that anything will ever pass it for me.
So did you come to the books before the show? And if you did, how long before the show were you reading them?
So when season 1 came out, I think I remember this correctly. I think I watched half the pilot I thought it sucked. I thought the show sucked actually. And then I read the books and I can't remember if I read the book before the pilot or after the pilot. It's kind of fuzzy for me, but I remember reading the books and being like, "Oh God, like this is amazing." And then
Mhm.
watching the show with a new appreciation and a new eye for it, and then actually enjoying the show after that. Um, I was also just tired of people telling me about the show. Also, like, do you
Yeah.
remember that? It was awful. It was terrible. Everyone, because everyone would
Everybody.
yeah, they would give a disclaimer. They would say,
Mhm.
"Well, it's fantasy, but not like that." And I always just thought that sounded so pretentious, and it pissed me
It
off.
does. It is
Yeah,
pretentious.
it is, but I'm pretentious, so I'm a hypocrite. So, but for me, I the books have always been something separate to the show, even when the show was
Sure.
in its peak and going on, and I can completely separate them in my head, and I feel sorrow for the people who cannot because of how disappointing the ending was. But I mean, those
Right.
books have formed me a lot of ways as a reader. And the other thing about the books that I love is the fact they're written by George R. R. Martin, who has written other things that I dearly love. I mean, Sand Kings is one of my favorite stories of all time now.
Hmm.
And it's 40 pages, which is crazy. And I
Yeah.
love Fever Dream. I love Dying of the Light, and I like Night Flyers. So like he's just an author I genuinely love. Whereas
Yeah.
like for instance, like Sanderson, I love the Stormlight Archive, but I don't love Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah, that's fair.
So it's like he is, I mean, he's probably my favorite author, probably.
Hmm. That's a strong claim and a strong love. What didn't you like about the pilot? You're probably the only person I've met that didn't like the pilot.
Oh, I was just being a contrarian. Let's be fair.
Okay.
And also I'm just not a person that likes television that much. And I also don't like kid actors. But
Fair.
let's be honest, Game of Thrones has maybe the best kid actors of all time. Like
They're
at
pretty
least since the
good.
Disney era, where everyone
Yeah.
was a Disney actor.
Yes. I miss the Disney era, honestly. I feel like that was probably a good time for a lot of people. But yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's funny though. I
Definitely.
remember so I came to the books after the show started. But my friend had been reading them since the early 2000s, basically. And he was telling us, he said, there's this series that's being adapted, and I want you to read it before it comes out because I know you and I know that you're going to watch it and that you're going to love it, but you should read the books. And I was like, yeah, I'll get around to it. It's fine. And started my bachelor's degree and was like, gonna put that show on. Everyone's talking about it because it has Sean Bean in it, and everyone loves Sean Bean for being Boromir. Like it's fine. Put it on and was hooked within the first 10 minutes. The opening sequence going beyond the wall for me, I was so in love with it. And went out and bought the first book the next day and then finished the book before episode 2 came out. And at that point was just enamored with it. And it was so fun because I then got to compare the book to the show and things were so fresh in my mind. And the first season did such a good job at staying so truthful to the book that I was so impressed. And then that changed dramatically later. But for the first few seasons, it was really fun.
It sure did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that first season was kind of magical when you think about like what it had to do and what it did do at that time. It maybe that wouldn't stand out in the crowd nowadays because of the effect that it's had in television and storytelling. But man, it did it in fantasy and in books, and then it did it again for television, and then really redefined what a premium television show can look like, sound like, and be like. It's kind of a crazy thing. I remember when I realized it was really big was I was in a wrestling locker room. I think her name was Sarah Logan in the WWE. She ended up getting signed to WWE, but I knew her as Scary Mary Dobson. And she was in the locker room, and I remember she was reading A Feast for Crows. And I was like, man, those books are great. And she's like, oh, this is like the 8th time I've read them. And I was like, oh my God. And then we just started talking about A Feast for Crows, and we were just nerding out, right? And I remember at the time, I think
that's awesome.
Madman Pondo was there. So somebody, anyways. And I just remember being like, man, if a wrestler's reading this, like this is big. This has to be big. I didn't know wrestlers could read other than me. No, I'm just kidding all my wrestling friends out there.
I knew it had superseded culture basically when my grandmother called me one day. And my grandma was the coolest. I miss her so much. And she just says to me on the phone, Laura, I started watching this show and I realized it was based on these books. So I went out and I bought all of them. And I'm reading them and I think you'd really like them. And I was like, okay, what's it called? And she said, the first one's called The Game of Thrones, which is also the name of the show. And I was like, yep, I am very familiar. I have read the books and I have watched the show on repeat. Are you telling me you like these books? And she probably ended up reading them 15 times. She just kept rereading them. She would read through, stop, go back to the beginning, start over. And no, Kyle, it is not the grandma that is your neighbor, because my other grandmother is basically Kyle's neighbor. They live like 5 minutes apart from each other. But yeah, she read them continuously until she died. And she ended up reading the Dunk and Egg stories. She had the big book. Like grandma had all of the stuff and was just obsessed with Game of Thrones, which probably enhances my feelings towards them because it was such a fun thing that we could bond over and share, which typically you're not calling your 85-year-old grandparent and being like, what did you think of the Littlefinger scene in the last episode? But it was awesome. She and I would watch the show Sunday and then have a complete debrief on Monday. And then she would go back into her book and then she would compare them to the books. And it was delightful. It was the best ever.
Yeah. Those experiences of family and community around, whether it be a television show or books, I think forms like a very special like moment in time around that piece, and it's very hard to ever separate from that. And I would actually say that it's probably even better to be like not separate yourself. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, wait, Jimmy the other day on Bookborn's comments, someone was like, Dunk and Egg are great, but they're nobody's favorite. I was like, have you heard of Jimmy Nuts? Oh, yeah, easily. Dunk and Egg is as good as the main series.
Oh yeah, they're great.
And if you haven't read them, or you have only once, a very important piece of context around these novellas is that George wrote them as he was releasing the main books. And there are things that happen in the Dunk and Egg novellas that actually prep us for something that's going to happen in the book that he was writing at the same time. A really good instance of this is the glamour. We see Bloodraven use a glamour in Dunk and Egg, and then we see Melisandre use a glamour in the book that was written alongside of it. There is a lot of little things about Dunk and Egg that informs
Parallels.
us. Yes, it's very, very worth the time. And also they're great stories. I think George, this sounds like heresy, but I actually think he's at his best in the short form. I think when he actually makes himself a little bit more brief, he can just do some really magical things. And I think that the Dunk and Egg novellas have this atmosphere of, yes, this world is dangerous, but it has this feeling of like seeking like your destiny out there. Like you're with Dunk and you're with Egg. And for all intents and purposes, they're just roaming the land. And Dunk is a lunk, thick as a castle wall.
Yeah.
But he's gonna one, find his place in the world, but he's also going to achieve being a knight. And there's nuances to that as well. But there's something really endearing and actually a little bit encouraging about Duncan the Tall story. I feel so passionately about the Dunk and Egg novellas. And when people tell me they haven't read them, I'm just like, what are you doing?
I love them. Joanna, you're going to really, really enjoy them because, as Jimmy said, they are so good. And honestly, the audiobook for that with Harry Lloyd is excellent because Harry Lloyd should really redo all of the books.
Yeah, he does a great job. Though I will say this, the first time I listened to it, I had a little bit of trouble because it was so relaxed and laid back, and I was thinking A Song of Ice and Fire, right?
Yeah.
But you have to understand that Dunk and Egg is like a different tone
Yep.
than the main series. It's actually the closest thing that George has ever put out in that universe to maybe a YA. It's not YA at all, but
No, but it is
you could hand it to a 14, 15-year-old, and I think that they would be okay with it. I think that is going to be one of the challenges for the Dunk and Egg television show that has been greenlit. I think people are going to go in expecting a certain thing, and if it's done, in my opinion, appropriately, it should feel different. And I wonder if people will not be as, you know what I mean, invested in that. I think if we could give it time, people will be. But it's going to be a little bit closer to maybe a Mandalorian vibe than necessarily like
a Star Wars.
Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of problems with that comparison, but just
I know
in that
exactly what you're saying, though. It's a different
quieter story.
Yeah, it's a different beat, and that's okay. So if you had your way, how long would the series be to tell all the Dunk and Egg stories? Would you make it one season per story? Would you make it a couple episodes per story? Like what's the ideal in Jimmy Nuts' world for this?
Well, I don't know enough about television, to be honest with you, but here's my thought. I think you could do like a really amazing 6-episode season of each of them.
That's what I think. Exactly.
Yeah, I think the second one might need a little bit of padding around the edges, possibly, which I'd be okay with. That's actually another one I think is actually underrated. A lot of people say, the second one's whatever. I actually like the second one quite a bit. But I think the reason why the show is going to be made, other than cash and money, because that's what it's really about.
That's the main thing, yes.
But I think that this is George's consolation prize to finish the Dunk and Egg novellas, because he had said there was going to be 7 and then 10. And at some point, I think someone said 12 or 13, but he does have an idea of where it goes. And it's very, very important to the main series as well, because the tragedy at Summerhall is kind of the crescendo of it all. Yeah. So I think this is our consolation prize. And I know some people get upset about that because it's not prose, but at the end of the day, it's an interpretation of what the story would have been, and I'm okay with that. And did you know that there is a play coming out, maybe possibly late 2024?
A play?
And you know what that play is going to cover?
Is it Summerhall?
The Tourney at Harrenhal.
Ooh,
He's going to tell us what happened at the tourney of Harrenhal in a
that'll
play.
be really fun.
Oh my God. I'm going to be on the first flight to London. It's happening. I'm going to be with my Targaryen flag. I'm going to be seated right dead center with my George R. R. Martin conductor hat on and my suspenders. I can't wait.
So I asked you prior to this conversation who you thought your favorite house was, and you said Dane, and yet you keep saying your Targaryen apparel. So come on, what
Well,
is
the
it? Is it
Targaryens are the
Targaryen or
reason why
Dane?
so many things go poorly. So
Well,
that's
yeah,
why, other than Jaehaerys, God rest his soul,
yes,
best king of all time. But I love House Dane because there's so many questions, and some of the
yes,
cooler questions in the world building is actually tied to House Dane and Starfall and sort of the more, you know what I mean? Like there's so much
so many,
there
yeah.
that we don't know about. And Ashara Dane's also one of the best question marks in the series, right after Howland Reed.
Such a good one. Yep, exactly. When when I was pregnant, we were going through all the possible names we wanted, and we were like, Ashara.
Let's go.
Like we strongly considered Ashara for a long time because we were like, oh, it's such a good story. And the whole thing with Arthur Dane and the Tower of Joy, like I live for that stuff. The prophecies in A Song of Ice and Fire for me are what I loved the most, even though I loved how lived in the world feels and the fact that you just feel like it's been there forever, and the fact that religion and culture is very strongly established in each place, which I feel we got a little bit more of in Essos than we get in Westeros, but I still loved it. But the prophecies were just what pulled me in and what kept me going. And so much of that stuff is linked to Azor Ahai. I was like, I need to know. Like, I just need to
Well,
know.
the prophecies are very compelling in A Song of Ice and Fire because George does a lot of things with them. It's not
Yeah,
just a one size fits all. He does
correct.
a whole range of things, and array of things. He tries to almost keep you guessing of what's real and what isn't. And some of the
Mhm.
prophecies are fulfilled in the most mundane, stupid ways.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, they came true. So are prophecies real in the
Yep.
world? And then there's prophecies that never came to fruition, right? There's dragon
Exactly.
dreams
Yep.
that get people, killed because they're trying to drink fire and all this other crazy nonsense. So it's
Yeah.
just like the motivations behind what people do, and I'm talking about in
Mhm.
like our life,
Yes.
sometimes can come from the most insignificant or weird thing. And
Mhm.
that is what leads to a lot of the greatest stories or greatest mysteries in our world. And I think George did an amazing job of mirroring that in A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, one of my favorite things in the world when I'm going to bed is to turn on Unsolved Mystery Icebergs on YouTube. I do it all the time. And sometimes this person ended up on this beach wearing this thing 7 miles
Yep.
away, and you're like, how?
Yep.
And what motivation caused that? And then if you look at like the lineage of decisions and endings for characters in A Song of Ice and Fire and the history of it, you're like, how did you get to the point where you're drinking wildfire, bro?
Right?
No, it
What
came from a
led to
dragon
that
drink.
decision?
Yeah. So like the chain of just ridiculousness down the line is always really interesting to me. But
Mhm.
then also it drives purpose, and
Yes.
there's certainly harmful things that come from prophecies. And this is something that I kind of feel like I have a little bit of experience in because I had so many pastors or preachers back when I was religious, when I was a young kid. I'm no longer religious, but would prophesy over me. And I
Mhm.
remember it steered my life. It steered
Mhm.
in directions, and it was not always helpful. I
No.
know that it was intended to be helpful, but it's something I feel like I can kind of relate to in some ways.
Mhm.
One of the worst things that happened, I don't know why I'm sharing this on a book stream, um, but I remember being prophesied over or whatever in church and being told that I had to be a certain position in the church or something, right? And that was going to be my life. And I took that to heart. I was like 13 or 14 years old though. Well, I grew up and that didn't happen. And it disappointed my grandmother to the point where it actually fractured our relationship in some ways. I
Oh,
was I
geez.
was I was very I was a disappointment to the family. And I
Yeah.
just remember being like, this prophecy that I had nothing, I didn't ask for this,
Right.
and this prophecy is over top of me and now has expectations. And like, it's a crazy thing, but that does
Mhm.
happen. in the real world. And George plays with that as well. All that to
Oh
say
yeah,
that
for sure. I'm
I
super
find some
curious
relation
now
to it.
what denomination of faith you were, because
I was Assemblies of God, which is a like a branch off of Pentecost kind of deal.
yeah, it
Kind of
sounded
connection.
Pentecostal. So I was curious. I have my degrees are in religion and history. So I'm always super fascinated in religion. I think it's one of the things that I love about fantasy in general too,
Yeah.
is religion builds so much within the world and is so often linked to the magic systems that we have. And this is one of the things that I also really love about A Song of Ice and Fire is the different religious sects you have in the
Yes.
story and how each of them has a very distinctive faith, a very distinctive idea of the order within those faiths and what their God can do. And I found that so fascinating, especially when, and it seems kind of basic, but I found it was so relatable with Kat
Mhm.
and Ned
Oh yeah.
because I was like, interfaith marriage is the thing. Like this is an
Mhm.
interfaith marriage. And I thought it was a really interesting character study as to how someone can respond to something that is so a part of themselves and their partner not sharing that with them and actively believing in a faith that thinks yours is wrong. It's just,
Yeah.
I thought it was really fascinating. So I liked that he included stuff like that.
Yeah, and Catelyn's reflections on how like Ned would go, pray at the
Yeah,
werewood,
in the
and
Godswood. Yeah.
how he kind of like that part of his life was almost like off limits for her, and he would
Mhm.
share things with that would never be exchanged with her. It's
Yeah.
almost like a piece that she couldn't really have of him, which
Mhm.
also plays into the idea that it's cold up in the north, and he
Yeah.
married her kind of out of duty, even though he might have loved there's so much to that. Like, just that
Mhm.
alone, that's so fascinating to talk about.
Yeah.
But I do love the religions in A Song of Ice and Fire a lot because, there's, like, little moments of shine for all of them where you're like, "Wait, is this the real one? Is this the real one?"
Mhm.
And I've heard, it might have been George R. R. Martin, but it might have also just been another, like, bigger content creator, but they basically said that, like, there's probably one God, and like it's interpreted in cultures differently, but it's truly like the same kind of power behind it all. And some of
Mm.
like everyone has a little bit of it right, possibly.
Sure.
But I mean, the Lord of Light seems
He seems like
demonstrably
he's leading
true.
the charge.
Yeah,
Like, he
like
seems
he's
so
there.
far like he's the one that's kinda like, "Hey, guys, I've got this under control," sort of.
But then you get the House of Black and White.
Yeah,
How
which
do you
is
explain that?
so fascinating. That was gonna be my next religion and fantasy video because I find the concept of giving death as a gift to be so interesting
Mhm.
and something that most people would not view of as a blessing. But when you look at it in our modern day context of doctor assisted suicide, I'm like, it's not that different, you know? And I feel like George was kind of at the forefront of thinking this is where medicine might go one day, but I'm going to put a really like weird, shift in that mentality where it's mercenaries basically rather than doctors. But I think it's so fascinating. But my favorite of the group is probably the Lord of Light, personally.
Yeah, I like Lord of Light because it's definitely a shout out to Roger Zelazny, and I love Zelazny quite a bit. So I I like all of them. I think
Yeah,
they're
they're all
fascinating.
great.
I think the free folk are fascinating people because they're essentially living
Oh,
in a different
interesting.
reality. And by
Yes.
the way, we're not calling wildlings anymore, folks. On Bend the Knee, we said that is no longer an acceptable term. This is 2023. We're going to 2024. The free folk. Damn it.
That is right. Oh man. What did you think of, so I want to talk about the show a little bit because we
Okay.
talked a little bit about this in our off-screen conversation last time. What did you think of the casting for the Free Folk and how their storyline was handled in the show versus in the books?
I'm overall okay with it because I know that Hollywood has to do Hollywood things. Like
Mhm.
I was under no assumption that it would look the way it should have looked, really. Because like I'm forgetting the names, the Thens up
Yeah.
there, like they should have actually. This is a side tangent. I'm sorry. There's like 40 people that don't know what I'm talking about. I think what if they are some sort of like cross breed of like White Walker and Free Folk?
I have thought that before, so you're not alone.
Because I am under no assumption that the White Walkers are as mindless zombies. I think
They're
it's
not.
very obvious that there's a lot more to them, and especially because I think he is using inspiration of the Scythe from Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which have their own culture, which is really,
Mhm.
really cool. So anyways, they should have been a little bit more grotesque. But I will say
Mhm.
this about Game of Thrones. I think it does a pretty good job of casting people who just aren't all gorgeous. I think that
Yeah,
they did a
oh,
good job of
100%.
casting. On the whole, I would say the show knocked it out of the park for the most part,
Agreed.
except for Year Long.
100. Oh, yeah. No, wasn't
Worst.
so my biggest gripe with casting for that show is that we didn't get Victorian and that it wasn't Ray Stevenson. Like, that was all I wanted for when we were getting to that time period. And then I started hearing the rumors that they were gonna kind of merge Euron and Victorian. And I was like, not here for that. And that for me was the my biggest gripe in terms of casting. But I can't remember Tormund's real name. It's Christoph something, I want to say. I thought he was probably the standout casting for me of the whole series. I loved him so much.
He's the one that
And
came out unscathed from all the
yeah,
controversy. Like
oh
Tormund
yeah,
was fine.
he was totally fine. I can also attest to this that when we had moved beyond book material, I was on edge to like an uncanny point whenever Tormund was in an encounter. It didn't matter how large the encounter was. I was gripping onto either the sofa or chair I was in or was pacing the room because I was so anxious that something would happen to Tormund. I was very emotionally invested in his well-being.
He's such a weird character in the books too, because sometimes he talks like a pirate. Like he says R.
Yeah.
And actually there's a lot of people who think that maybe Tormund is someone else, like because he isn't consistent, but I think it's probably just George writing wildly. Who knows, I guess. I'll let
Mhm.
people have their fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tormund's fantastic.
I love him so, so deeply. Do you have a particularly favorite group of people in the books?
In the books, I don't know if I want to say the favorite, but the people I feel like not a lot of people talk about, like when we're talking about houses or like bands of people, is the Brotherhood without banners. Let's go! It's
Yeah,
so cool.
it
Beric
is.
Dondarrion is the man. Like
He's such a good character. And also, if we're talking about the show, his fight scene with the Hound is one of the best
super
scenes
good.
ever in the show. It's phenomenal. It's such a great scene.
I mean, and not to completely pivot here, but like, by the way, one of the things that I love about the Hound is that the Hound is like this big barbarian type dude. I mean, not barbarian, but like, he's the Chad. He's the Uber Chad.
Yeah.
And, he's kind of playing by his own rules. He's nasty and
Mhm.
still has trauma from his
Oh, yeah.
past that affects him in a very important part of his life in an event of Blackwater Bay. And it literally catapults him out into the world. And
Yep.
to me, that's the stuff. So I saw somebody say this on another stream, and I just thought it was the most ignorant thing I've ever heard. And they said that George R. R. Martin is all about the kills and thrills, and that's it. And he doesn't actually look into the trauma. It's about the action and not the fallout, which is like a clear indication that they didn't read the books, in my opinion,
Yes.
or have no reading comprehension.
Exactly.
Because literally the Hound by himself is an
Yeah.
example of not just what happens to him in the series, but things from his past
Oh,
that feel
yeah.
real because he actually reacts in ways where that trauma would affect him later in life. It is
Mhm.
it is very human. And
Oh,
I would also make the argument
100%.
that what'd you say?
100%.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I thought you said who said that, and I'm like, it's a random commenter that didn't actually matter, but I just got
No.
super upset about it. Uh, because I think that one of the issues with gritty, realistic fantasy that, like, everyone wanted to write after that, and that's what they
Right.
wanted. Um, they missed the point. They
Yeah.
missed the point. They thought if they just built up a character and killed it, that was enough, and that was not enough.
No.
It was never just about those things. That is just one layer of the cake. And does he do that very well? Yes. But all you have to look at is Tyrion Lannister. One of
Oh
the
yeah.
reasons why people dislike A Dance with Dragons is because you have to sit with him while he broods, but it's earned. Like it is a realistic depiction of probably what someone would be like after doing what he did. And
Mhm.
treachery. He didn't just do something fantastical or devious and be like, huh, aren't I a
Yeah, that was
character?
great.
Yeah, it's not that. It is almost him degrading as a
Mhm.
human. And
Oh yeah.
and then giving up his name and his identity. A lot of what A Song of Ice and Fire does well, and the thing that I'm drawn to about it is identity, because I'm someone
Mhm.
who has struggled with identity my entire life, and I still struggle with it to this day because I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know who I am. I don't know if I am doing everything I could be doing, and it's just a really big struggle because every single person that looks at you sees you as something different. And
Sure.
that's a really trippy thing to think about. And George does a phenomenal job of inspecting identity. The
Yeah.
Every single character that's in the Vale is actually underneath a fake name or a different identity. But
Yeah.
that is all throughout the series. I mean, the
Right.
Hound's identity as almost like a Conan type guy, right?
Mhm.
That
Well, I mean, just by the fact that he's called the Hound, that's not his person. That is a name that has been ascribed to him, an identity that has been ascribed to him, and it's underneath that a person that is struggling with major PTSD. Like, which
Kingslayer.
yeah, exactly. It's it's an idea that someone formulates about you and that becomes you. And often then people, it's like Tyrion says, you use those words to become your armor so that they can never be used against you. Like dwarf or bastard and all of those things. That's
Mhm.
the same thing that the Hound says, okay, if that's what you're going to call me, then that's what I'm going to become. Jamie's very similar in that Jamie, I Jamie's my favorite character. So I will defend Jamie to the nth degree, but Jamie, you come to learn later in the series, is a victim of abuse. You don't think that early on when you're reading him do terrible things to, children in book 1, but you see that development over the story and you go, "No, no. There are so many layers to this person just as there are with every person, and that's not to say that there aren't fundamentally bad people because some people are just bad people and there's not really
Yes.
much dimension going on with them. But historically, in that series, especially, anytime someone has been given a moniker or a name like that, you're like, what's going on there? There's usually something that's motivating that. And then it goes much, much deeper.
Yeah, and also you start to think about how you don't get a Jamie perspective until book 3.
Yeah.
And when you get the Jamie perspective, everything that you've been told is now coming from the other side of the aisle.
Yep.
And you start to think that maybe some of this honor stuff that Ned Stark was about was kind of bunk. Maybe it was all
Mhm.
trash, because
Yep.
whenever I hear about what really happened and what Jamie did and then what was being done to Ned's family, I can only think, Ned, you're a dummy. Like
Yeah.
you're dumb for treating him this way. Or you
Mhm.
look at Brienne, and this is the best thing about Brienne and Jamie, is that she calls him Kingslayer the entire time because she's projecting, because to the realm, to the populace,
Yeah.
she is also a Kingslayer.
Oh, yeah.
She has been accused of slaying a
Of
king.
killing Renly. Yeah.
And we know that it's not true, but she will not extend that grace towards Jamie because it's the last thing she wants to be called. So
Oh,
by
yeah.
calling him that, and then Jamie calls her wench like a million times.
A million
Um,
times.
it's so ridiculous. But like
Uh,
their relationship together is just
it's it's one of my all-time favorites. Like, if you were to look at and I wanna do a video on it, the best partnerships in fantasy, they are definitely at the top for me, even though it's by no means a conventional partnership. I love the 2 of them together so much because it's so good because you have 2 people, which I mean, this can be said about most of the characters in Game of Thrones, but Brienne is the clear example I give to people whenever the argument is that George doesn't write quality women and only writes women to be taken down or abused or something like that. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Let me tell you about Brienne of Tarth and how every woman at some point in their life has been Brienne of Tarth. Like, there is not a singular woman I've ever met that can't relate to how she felt as a young girl, feeling like she wasn't pretty enough, she wasn't good enough, she was awkward in her body, she had bigger aspirations for herself than
Yeah.
were going to be available to her. And pairing her with egotistical Jamie is such an interesting dynamic, because you have someone who has struggled, both people have struggled so much, like you said, with their identity for their whole lives, and they're having to confront a lot of these things with each other, and they don't know how to do it. And it makes for such interesting dialogue. I love the two of them collectively, and I love them apart. They're both great.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said A Feast for Crows is very much a feminism, a book about feminism in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. It's also a book about obsession, which I also am very fascinated by as a theme. Cersei is phenomenal. What a phenomenal character. So many troubling things about Cersei.
Oh, yes.
I have a friend Tanner, and he dubbed A Feast for Crows the hot girl fiction book, which hot girl fiction is kind of like the messy, Boy Parts by Eliza Clark and My Year of Rest and Relaxation kind of, but it really is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Cersei just being a mess, which is entertaining, by the way, but also is kind of sad in many ways,
It can
because
be.
she is trying to do everything except be the daughter of Tywin Lannister, right? She knows that she's been held back by the patriarchy, and
Yes.
probably wasn't afforded a lot of the opportunities that would have probably made her a better schemer and a better player
Yeah.
of the Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I think some people read that as in like George showing the woman their role, but I don't believe that he's putting the fault on her. I think a lot of the
No.
fault comes from Tywin.
Oh, 100%. I think that is strictly acknowledging reality. Like,
Yeah.
this isn't a world that is a fantasy world in the sense that women are able to marry whomever they want or decide to not marry and have children. It is a fantasy world that mimics our own real world, in that women didn't have a lot of choice, especially if their father was someone like a Tywin, whom I love, by the way. I am a great fan of Tywin. I think he is such a phenomenal character, especially in the show. Charles Dance was absolute perfection.
Nailed it.
Oh my God. His opening scene, which we're pescatarian in my house, so I don't like seeing animal death in general, but watching him skin a stag, I was like, no one could have done this better than Charles Dance.
Epic scene.
Yeah, it's such a good scene. And yeah, I mean, you want to pity Cersei at times, like, and it's interesting now when I think back on the story, because when I read it the first time, I was in my early 20s and I wasn't a parent, and I am a parent now. And I think very differently on Cat and Cersei than I did the first time I read it. And I had a problem when I read it initially that my brain aged up a lot of the characters. And this is my one complaint for Martin, is that I feel he does not write children in the way that children speak. He writes them as if they are significantly older. So when I'm in a Sansa POV, I'm like, how old are you again? Like, you're not 16 or 17, you're 11 or 12. Okay, I have to really remind myself of that.
Yeah, I do think I think you're right. I think that is probably why we age them up in our heads. Also, might just be because we feel like the situations that they're in require them to be a bit older, which is fair.
Yeah.
The one thing that he does do really well with kids, though, is the sibling battling back and forth and the bickering.
Yeah.
Very realistic, in my opinion, and very well written. But yeah, I mean, if there's an issue with the books, it would probably be the fact that the age of the characters, I don't know. But he also threw away the 5-year gap and said, if 14-year-old has to save the world, then so be it. It is what it is. And it is fantasy. So
yeah. I mean, to be fair, pretty much every fantasy author at some point or another was like, 14, 15, you're the person.
Yeah, you're the chosen one.
The chosen one, and the world all depends on you. Like, at what point are we going to get someone that's like 55 that's had life experience and they're like, probably you.
I mean, that's why I do love First Law, by the way, and also
Yeah.
the Second Apocalypse is the characters are older, and I
Yeah.
feel like I can relate to them a little bit more.
Uh,
I
I completely agree.
I will say, like, coming to newer stories now,
Mhm.
I don't mesh with it as much as I used to, with the younger characters, and probably because 'cause I'm getting older, but also it's just because, like, I don't know, I see so much of it.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, give me a 28 or 32-year-old person that is just disgruntled. That's why I
Yeah.
sell Second Apocalypse to people. I don't sell it often because it's very brutal, but, like, a commune is basically a middle-aged, middle of the road sorcerer that, like, kinda just hates where he's at and the bureaucracy of it all.
Mhm.
Um, now that makes it sound very lighthearted. It's not. But
Yeah.
that is kinda who he is, and a commune's a miserable bastard. I mean, just a miserable human being,
Yeah.
and, I don't know if I love him for it, but I love reading about it.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I've been telling a lot of people this year that I'm really starting to move beyond that main character protagonist being a teenager, and I would like to see more older characters. And I think this might be why Oathbringer was such a success for me compared to other people, is that Dalinar is the protagonist of that book. And I'm like, dude's in his 50s, and I'm here for it. Like, I'm so here for this because he's lived a life already, and we're getting flashbacks for that. And I don't feel I personally did not feel the same level of impact having flashbacks for Kaladin. Even though some of his flashbacks are very sad and I feel for him in those moments, I'm more interested in Dalinar because his growth is much more significant.
Hmm.
And that was so eye-opening in Oathbringer. I was like, oh, this is a new dimension to Dalinar that we're seeing, and it's very different. And I'm here for this. And I love also that he is in a relationship with an older person too. I
Mhm.
love that, and I wish there was more of that in fantasy.
Yeah, I wish there was also just, like, more good relationships in
Yes,
fantasy. Like, I actually think that Ned and Kat Stark, I mean, for as little they're on the page together, like, overall,
they're not
but that's
bad.
a realistic marriage. Like, there's
Yeah,
things
it
that
is.
aren't perfect. I like that. I
Mhm.
enjoyed that. But there's also a ton of problematic relationships in the Song of Ice and Fire, right? Between Robert and Cersei are terrible, uh,
Oh, they're
for one
not
another.
great.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really point, to good marriages in the Song of Ice and Fire. Maybe, Highgarden, Olenna Tyrell and Mace Tyrell, maybe that they were a pretty good example of an elderly couple.
Mhm.
But just in fantasy in general, I kinda wish that there were, like, happy older couples, like people who
Yeah.
made it. That would be
There's
nice.
really not. That's the thing. Most fantasy moms are dead or killed. And or we just are dealing with an orphan in general and both
Yeah.
parents are out of the picture. So, yeah, I would love to start seeing a bit more of a wider scope of what we can offer in terms of parentage and relationships to our protagonists. But well, there is one scene from the show Game of Thrones with Robert and Cersei
Phenomenal.
where I that one is so good, but the one I know which one you're talking about, and it's the scene where they talk about what went wrong in their marriage, basically. It's such a great scene. But the scene that I'm referencing is when he slaps her and she says, "I'll wear it as a badge of honor." And he says, "Don't make me honor you again," or something like that. And my husband and I laughed at that scene because Mark Addy's delivery was everything. But Mark Addy for me was one of the characters that I wish we would have had more time with. Yeah, because
Yes.
I love him so much. House Baratheon is probably my favorite house. I find them so fascinating. I love Stannis. I'm a hardcore Stannis stan, which is
Stannis
fun to
the
say.
Menace.
Yeah, he is so great. And show Stannis sucked. I'm saying that right now. And book Stannis is
Hmm.
just S tier for me. They're very different. And that's not to say that book Stannis isn't going to go on to make terrible decisions like show Stannis. I anticipate those decisions will be coming. But in the show, it felt that Stannis was very much at the disposal of Melisandre. And in the book, I liked that you couldn't tell who was using who. And I always really appreciated that when I read it. I was like, this seems like it's an advantageous relationship for both parties here. Whereas
Mhm.
in the show, I was like, oh, she's just leading him wherever she wants.
Well, yeah, and part of that's because George purposely didn't give us Stannis's POV. He
Mhm.
remains a bit of a mystery, which is
Yeah.
good because Stannis is very black and white, and
Yes.
I don't know if he'd be an interesting POV, to be
I
honest.
don't think he would, honestly. But Davos's POVs are delightful, and I love them.
And Davos is proof. People say, "Oh, everyone is on Vice Fire is terrible. They're all bad people. It is a nihilistic series," and you can just look at
No,
Davos. Davos
Davos.
is a man finding religion.
Mhm.
Uh, Fun
I love
fact.
Davos. Also, Samwell Tarly is a very good person. Like,
Bingo.
two people that are, yeah, I would say that they're probably the best of the best.
Yeah, I
If
would
we're
say
looking at everybody.
I mean, Maester Aemon was excellent.
Oh,
Brienne is an
so
excellent
good.
person. I mean, Brienne, other
Mhm.
than being a little prickly, for all the crap she takes for being a female knight.
I
Um,
agree, but with Brienne, I feel that she suffers a little bit from Ned syndrome, where it's too honor focused at times, and I'm like, you guys got to break some of the rules to get stuff done, and it might be
yes,
a bit more successful.
that's absolutely true. Uh, there's some good Martells, right?
I love Ariane.
I do
I
too.
don't think you'd classify her as good.
Eh, Yeah, I mean, and who is really wholly good? Because even Davos has been
Mhm.
away from home for a very long time, and he was a
Really long
smuggler.
time.
Real
Yeah.
long time.
He's been up to some questionable things. I think honestly, if you were to rank it, Sam has got to be the top because he's dealt a pretty
Bro.
poor hand by his father.
Samwell Tarly is
Yeah.
the antithesis of everyone, and everyone says it is nihilistic. Samwell Tarly exists, and he
Yeah.
is a unremarkable person doing remarkable things at every turn of the story and
Yeah.
being the backbone to
Mhm.
one of the main characters, if not the main character of Jon Snow. But
Mhm.
he is actually the one doing amazing feats. I mean,
Oh
he
yeah.
overcomes his fear. And the thing is, he doesn't overcome his fear and then is like, I am no longer scared. He is
Right.
always scared. It is, and I
Mhm.
know George has said it's his right in. Like
Yeah.
Samwell is George, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, I think that Samwell Tarly has a big role to play actually in a lot of the major events that are coming. But um,
Definitely.
yes, the series is very dark, but the world will be saved by people who are end up being heroic that people would have never guessed to be heroic, or
Oh
people who
yeah.
have counted people out. Someone like Jamie who has been disgraced, who
Mhm.
could come back. It is heroic fantasy. It's just not how we had known it. Nowadays,
Oh, yeah.
it's not as crazy, but when it was
Mhm.
written and thought of, it was very different. Not that there wasn't other stuff like that out there. There's anti-heroes, I know,
Mhm.
but George was putting his hat in. So
It for its time though, when you look at our classical fantasy, if you want to look at Tolkien, I mean, the hero's journey is the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell wrote extensively on what the hero's journey is. And A Song of Ice and Fire is so interesting because it's so many different heroes' journeys happening
mm,
simultaneously and
mm,
intersecting that impede the other hero's journey, which is what makes it so fascinating. Because if you look at Ned for the
yeah,
first book is our quintessential hero, right? He's forced into a situation. He has to leave home. He goes on a journey. He goes through this tumultuous thing and then kind of bites it, which is unfortunate. But you then have that sprouting Arya's hero's
yeah,
arc. John has his hero's arc at the wall. Catelyn goes on her journey to go save Ned. And that's just one family, and there's so many other offshoot effects that then come from those actions. It's so fascinating because that whole series is a hero's journey and an anti-hero's journey, and they're all intersecting with each other all the time.
yes, yes, and you know, also, when you're thinking about these massive events, some of the biggest events in this world are happening on these very micro level decisions.
Yep.
And George has built a historical context to the series and done a phenomenal job of referencing it in the current day story about, well, of course we know Kristen Cole, and then we hear Kristen Cole's real story and we're like, oh my God,
Yeah.
that's crazy. And
Yeah.
he furthers this in Fire and Blood. But my point is that one of the coolest things you can do after you've reread the series is that you can say, who is going to be written down in the history books? Because it's
Mhm.
not going to be Samwell Tarly.
No.
Ned Stark is a traitor in the history books, depending on who wins
Yeah.
this war.
Mhm.
Ned would be an honorless, traitor essentially, and
Mhm.
it depends. But if the Starks were to come out on top, Ned is, a martyr almost in a
Yeah.
lot of ways to the tyrannical rule of the Lannister Baratheon, really Lannisters, right? Um,
Mhm.
and he's put time in to build that historical context. This is something Malazan also does extraordinarily well. And you get to the end of Malazan and you think about some of the epic things that you've been on, and you realize that like there may not be a record of this. You may not see this in a history book,
Sure.
and that is heart wrenching to think about the people who sacrificed their lives in
Mhm.
wars of our past of our time. Right.
Yeah.
I always think about how, like, if you were back in the Middle Ages, or even like let's say during the Roman Empire, and you're going out on these battles, and you
Yep.
probably think this is the battle of all time,
Mhm.
and then you go out and maybe you did help win. Like maybe it was this one dude that made it over the wall and he
Yeah.
sprung the whole thing, and we'll never know their name.
Nope.
And they're not written in the history books. And then some people are portrayed in history in a very different light than they really were.
Oh,
And
Napoleon.
yeah, yeah. And then Fire and Blood does this amazingly because we have a couple different sources. And the different
Yeah.
sources have all types of different things to say depending on what side they
Mhm.
were on. And
Yeah.
it's amazing to think about it. I mean, the history books will not have Brienne of Tarth and Jamie's adventures. We're
No.
getting to see these intimate micro level decisions and interactions that are going to affect the destiny of it all. And I think what George is going to do with Daenerys is I think that's her end. I think Daenerys is going to be a hero that will never be sung, and she will always be underappreciated for what she did. I think that's the tragedy for her.
Maybe I hope that's the tragedy that they go with rather than the tragedy we saw in the show. But it's interesting the way you remark about that for ancient Rome and stuff, because this was one of my key points of the book Augustus when I was talking to Alan and
Mhm.
Joanna about it, in that John Williams could have gone about that book and written about the two big battles that take place, which is
Yeah.
Philippi and Actium, that set up Augustus's rule. But he doesn't, and he focuses on the everyday people. And there is a letter in there from a soldier to his father, and it's one of my favorite notes in the book because
Mm.
it's so relatable. And I sat back after I read it and I was like, how many of those existed? And we don't know of these people. We know of the great acts that they, or great
Yes.
wars that they were involved in, but that war is attributed to Agrippa and Augustus. We don't know of, Lucinus, who was from the Apennine and was sent off to war and never came back, but was instrumental in its win. We don't know about these people. And it's a shame that we don't know about these people because history is written by the victors and we know of the main players. We never know of the secondary characters, which is why, again, when you look at A Song of Ice and Fire, the world, because it's so lived in and has that established history where you know of the minor houses and you know
Yep.
of the major houses, and the fact that houses have been extinct, like that for me
Yeah.
was probably the most exciting part of Fire and Blood. And then
Mhm.
House of the Dragon was, we're going to see these houses that we've heard of and we've never met. And we see, in one case in particular, the end almost of that house. And it's like, that's really fascinating. But it's such a lived in world where you know people from the very bottom, like in Flea Bottom, a Davos type character, all the way up to the king.
Yeah.
And it's what makes it such a compelling character study.
And you also have people being transported from one way of life to another.
Yeah.
Arya literally arrives as an honored guest
Yeah.
of the Lord of Winterfell, and then ends up a boy on a Night's Watch cart with criminals
Yeah.
eating pigeons. I mean, like it's
Yeah,
just a crazy it's a crazy transformation, and it's culture
absolutely.
shock, and just the way that he addresses that, and then you see the way they treated Arya when she was a lady, and then they
Mhm.
see the way they treat her whenever they don't know who she is, and that
Exactly.
says a whole lot about
Oh,
that
yeah.
society. And I think that, like, when I read things like this in like Malazan, or as Joanna said, like Stoner,
Mhm.
I think this is why it's really important to listen to each other. Like, I think in life sometimes you have to take a breath, and just like the person that's like looking at you, like you just have to
Mhm.
hear them. You
Yeah.
don't it doesn't have to be um an opportunity to make a witty comment. It doesn't have to be a thing to wait to talk next. It doesn't have to be the most memorable moment in the world. Like, maybe just listen to how somebody's day was.
Mhm.
Because I think that there are little heroics in everyone's days. Uh,
Oh,
I, Getting out of
definitely.
bed is heroic in
Mhm.
some ways, and because unfortunately the reality is that many of us will not be remembered. I think the
No.
least we can do is hear each other in the moments.
Oh, absolutely, and it's one of those things that the smallest action can stick with someone for their entire life, and we are a snippet in that person's life. I've been
Mhm.
in instances before where we've gone to a concert or a show or something, and I look around the room and I think, I'll never see these people again in my life.
Yeah.
There's never gonna be an instance where I'm gonna encounter you again, but we're sharing this unique experience together,
Hmm.
and that's really interesting to me,
And they go
where
home and celebrate birthdays and anniversaries, and they have their own little thing
they
going
have
on.
their own existence that you were a part of for a blip of time. And I
Mhm.
think back to moments where it's like, there were two instances that I think of regularly. And Montreal is where I lived and grew up, and it's a weird city if people have ever been there. People like to really protest, and we like Poutine. It's a great place. You should go visit. And when I was going to school one day, there's a lot of political strife in Montreal because Montreal is a bilingual city and historically was French, but it is an English nation. So the two are constantly at odds with one another. And the new government had come in and was trying to implement these really racist laws. And this was very much pre-COVID because people were on the corner and they had these poster boards up and they were like, want a hug. And I am not normally a touchy feely person. And I walked straight up to that person and just bear hugged them and was like, this set me up for the rest of my day. And I had a great day. I have no idea who that person is. I will never encounter them again. But that is a fundamental memory for me. And I then paid that forward when a few months later in the women's bathroom at my university, this girl was hysterically crying, didn't know her, and was like, "Can I just hug you? Because I feel what you're feeling right now, and I want to help you feel better." And we hugged, and I was like, "Cool, have a good one," and left. And, and like, it's just these weird little things that can stick with you and change you in ways that you don't really think about until maybe you do that for somebody else. And it's in those little moments in these stories, like with Brienne and Jamie, where you see
Yeah.
two people that likely shouldn't have encountered each other, that are encountering each other, that are changing each other, even though they're with each other for a blip of time.
Yeah.
And it's just real and relatable. And I love that about Martin because it's one of the few times where even though you're in a fantasy world, you're dealing with real people and you're dealing with real situations. And it's so relatable to everyday life.
Yeah. I mean, even when Tyrion and Jon Snow meet in book one for a very brief amount of time and share
Oh
some words
yeah.
together, John thinks back on Tyrion quite a bit. I think he takes it with him. I think it's actually kind of part of what gets him through a lot of the stuff
It
he
is.
goes through at the wall. And then Tyrion actually thinks about the wall a lot.
Yes, he does.
So it's just it's a crossing of paths and moving on
Yeah.
and doing these things. But those moments, and that's it. We're getting to peek in A Storm of Swords or Feast for Crows or Game of Thrones. Like we're getting to peek in on these moments that in history will be a part of a much larger narrative. And you're able to think this way because George has given historical context, not only within the main series, but also wrote a history book and a world book and all these other things.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm so enamored by it. I mean, I really
Yeah.
feel for these people, and I love the world. I love the feeling of it.
So I have to ask because now we're getting context from House of the Dragon that we can apply to our view of Westeros and our story in general.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we've seen what the Targaryens had being a ruling family, does that change your opinion on Viserys at all?
You're talking about Viserys, Dany's Viserys, right?
Correct.
I mean, he's certainly a Targaryen, without a doubt. You know, he had his history books, and also I think he was old enough to see Rhaegar and to see what they were and what it once was. So it makes complete sense. But do I feel any remorse for the guy? Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. I'm not going to have a ton of empathy for the ruling class. It's just not. In fact,
not 100% of the time. But
yes.
I do view his character slightly differently in the sense that I look back on it now and I feel for him and the weight that he's carrying on his shoulders, that he legitimately feels he is the only hope of their dynasty. And knowing now what that looked like, I'm like, oh, okay. I feel the weight a little bit more than maybe I previously would have.
And probably learned the wrong lessons because of what was talked about Targaryens and what it is being a Targaryen. Are you Jaehaerys? Are you Maegor? Yeah. Because you could be either. It's up to you.
Yeah. I think we have a very clear distinction on that one.
I think so. I will say this. I think that the House of the Dragon show is very, very awesome in the fact that I think it's very much like critiquing like a royal type family in that system. And sometimes I think people miss that because I remember people being very upset about some peasants dying in a certain episode and be like, they didn't even care about the people. And it's like, now you're starting to get it.
Yeah, exactly.
These aren't good people. They're terrible rulers.
Yeah, they're not. I did appreciate that about House of the Dragon. So let's talk about House of the Dragon a little bit. You seem to have a really positive experience with the show overall.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was a lot of hurdles for them to overcome, and they did have to change some stuff as well. But like on the whole, I think Ryan Condell is the only person in the world that should be running a Song of Ice and Fire shows. Like, I don't think there's anybody else that should be doing it. He's close to George. He knows the Dunk and Egg ending, by the way. He is in possession of the ending of Dunk and Egg.
Someone has been trusted with it already.
Yeah, George thinks the world of Ryan Condell.
Yeah.
And I do too. And you hear him talk about it. I mean, you really can't imagine the show being on better hands other than George himself. So
yeah, I would agree. I did have a few nitpicky things about the show. One was editing for one episode in particular, where it was the funeral episode, and it was very clearly shot in the daytime, and they put those night filters on their cameras. And I was like, guys, we know you can film at night because they did 40 days of night shoots for the Battle of Winterfell. Like, I know it's not people's favorites, but the shadows are really long on the beach right now, and it's super awkward to see. So I didn't love that.
I don't notice any of that stuff. So like when it comes to those critiques, I have none because like I'm dumb.
I'm hypercritical of that stuff just because anything that takes me out of a story makes me somewhat critical. And I'm very detail oriented. So in a scene, I'm that person that I look at all the background fodder. I want to know exactly what's in a scene. With Corliss's room, I was looking at all the objects and was so excited. And that really took me out of that episode. And my other major thing was the scene with Melly's breaking through the floor.
To the
I was
floor,
like,
yeah.
this was just that big moment that they wanted of like, look how badass she is. And I was like, no, like, I'm not here for this moment. I'm not here for it. It doesn't make sense.
See, I like that moment. I know that the physics of that are messed up.
And that's
But
my issue with it, is the physics.
yeah. Outside of that, like, I don't have any issues with it really. But I don't pay attention to those things. But I know what you mean, because I read, and I am kind of fascinated with how people write and why writing works for certain people.
Yeah.
And I like to do this because it challenges me to find things that people do well in books that I don't like as well. Like there are things that authors that are considered bad writers that probably do things well, and then vice versa, right? And the more I've done that, the easier it has been for me to be kicked out of the fictive dream. And Sanderson happens to be one of those people. I mean, he has a couple things that he does almost formulaically. And
Yeah.
once you see, if you're aware of it, at least for me, it's very distracting, like very,
Yeah.
very distracting. And it's bothersome. So I understand that. And I think I'm more like that in writing than I am in
Sure.
like TV and film and stuff. Cause like, I don't know anything about anything as far as that stuff goes.
Yeah.
So for me, it was always more about like, does this make sense for this character? Does, you know what I mean? Like the story elements of it, which I thought were pretty tight for the most part. I just don't understand how Patty Constantine didn't get an Emmy. I don't understand it.
Oh my, I am so infuriated that the walk through the throne room alone,
Arguably the best moment in Game of Thrones television history.
The best moment, and it should have won him every singular award. When my husband and I watched it, we paused it in that moment. And we never will pause one of these shows live. And we looked at each other and we're like, that's the best scene that's ever been in the original series and this, right? Like,
yes,
we can agree on that. And both just were nodding at each other, because we were doing a podcast about it when it came out initially, which was the start of my channel. It was Fantasy Awash with Laura and Josh. And then Josh got too busy for Laura, and then it just became Fantasy Awash. That episode was so fantastic, and just that scene as a whole. But Patty Constantine was the reason my husband was excited to watch the show, because he really liked him.
I like him a lot.
Yeah, he's great. So, and I mean, if you're familiar with the source material, you know what's going to happen to his character. Like, it's not a surprise. And you know that you're only going to have him for a certain amount of time, which you do for most of these characters in the Targaryen lineage. But yeah, I feel he was absolutely robbed of a very deserved award.
Yeah, I think that the fact that we're talking about any House of the Dragon episodes even being on the same playing level as stuff from season 1, 2, 3, 4, even 6 is crazy. I mean, to think about the weight that House of the Dragon had on it. And as someone who has been running a Song of Ice and Fire podcast for a while, it was a little bit hard there for a while, people. I mean, like when season 8 ended, there was only a few of us carrying the banners, and we kept saying, have faith in this. Like, they're going to do more shows, and who knows? And the amount of validation I felt after watching the pilot of being like, guys, I think this is going to be good. And people being like, I remember like YouTubers and streamers like, oh, we've seen this before. Like, they're shitting on the trailer, all this stuff. And it's like, if you look at the details, everyone that was a problem in seasons 7 through 8 were gone. And everyone who made it amazing was back.
Yeah.
And it's like, guys, this is perfect. George wasn't barred from the writer's room anymore. There's a ton of things that signified to me that it was going to be good. But if you think about the weight that was on that television show, it's crazy. The most disappointing finale possibly of all time, right?
Yes.
To people saying this is not relevant in pop culture anymore. This is dead. It'll never be. No one will remember it. And then, boom, HBO's biggest show of the year. I mean, and among, I think it was in the top 3 or number 1 for all shows, streaming number wise. So
it was, I think, number 1, and
it's almost underrated if you think about what it did in like the fandom. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I I was very much of the opinion that I would watch whatever they put out. I would
Mhm.
give it a few episodes and see if it found its footing as long as D&D weren't involved. That was my qualifier. I was like, I will never watch anything by them ever again.
Well, I can't
Um,
I can't say I'm on that train because they're doing Three Body Problem.
are they really?
I think it's gonna be excellent. Listen, these guys, listen, I know. I don't like them either, but they added some amazing stuff when they were
They
following
did.
source material,
They did. And
and they're not writers. I mean, they are, but they're not really.
but
Like,
they
they're not great.
shouldn't be. They really shouldn't be. I mean, was it David Benioff that wrote the screenplay to Troy? I mean, that's all I need to say. And it's just, if you've seen it, you know, Eric Bana looks amazing in that movie and is amazing because it's Eric Bana, but that's pretty much the extent of the goodness in that film.
I have high
No,
hopes for it, but we'll see if they can if they can do the Three Body Problem justice. I mean, they might have redemption, which is a crazy thing to think of.
I feel like that might be the case for you. I don't know if that would unanimously be accepted.
I have to say this every single time I talk about these two. There is a narrative on the other side of this that people say, well, they would have done well if they wouldn't have ran out of source material. They deviated from the source material before they ran out of source material.
Oh
They
yeah,
had
yes, they
stopped.
did.
They had actually stopped consulting George
Yeah,
before they ran out of source material.
yeah.
And so that is a false narrative that people say, well, they did great until they ran out of stuff. That is not true.
No,
There is a moment at the end of season 4 that,
Yep, there it is.
yeah, and that's just one. There
Yeah.
was many other things, and fidelity to the source material is not always indicative of quality.
No, definitely not.
But you have to keep with the tone of like what you've done prior, and we all know these things, so I'm not going to go on and on about it.
Yeah.
But I always have to say this because it's just this thing that is repeated ad nauseum on the internet because people hate George. That D&D are not in the wrong here, or they don't deserve all the blame, and I just simply don't agree.
No,
They wanted a fundamentally different experience with the series than what
mhm.
George wanted. So
I it's an odd position to be in as a viewer because I both fundamentally appreciate the fact that they brought fantasy to television because up until this point we were pretty much dealing with the Lord of the Rings films being
yeah,
most people's modern exposure to fantasy in cinematic format, which I love. I still to this day I'm like they're perfect. I would not change a singular thing about the extended versions of Lord of the Rings. Love them so much. But fantasy viewership owes a lot to D&D for the fact that they read this material and were like, this would work for television, and bringing audience is on a journey with them and saying it's an entirely new experience and I hope you're here for the ride with us. And simultaneously it is so frustrating because you see what they gave to us in the beginning, and then at the end you go, really?
yeah. I
We
mean,
trusted you guys.
they clearly were done with
Yeah,
the project. I mean,
they
they
were
were
burnt
offered
out.
an extension to 10 seasons. They denied it. George wanted 13.
Which I think would have been appropriate, honestly, and I would
But
have been there for it.
I will acknowledge this. That is almost an impossible task to do a TV show for 10 years, it would be way beyond 10 years, probably been 15
Yeah.
years with that cast at that level of performance. It is the fact that there was only a few recasts is actually one of the biggest blessings for the television show. Because for
Yes,
instance, the Wheel of Time show had to recast Matt, and I didn't
Matt.
watch season 2, but I actually thought Matt was the best part of season 1 that I
He
watched.
was. Barney Harris was my favorite part of season 1. I thought he was the best cast. I will say I also, for the most part, have really liked the casting for Wheel of Time. But I did like Barney Harris the best and was very upset to find out that he wouldn't be coming back. But I really did like the guy that they recasted him with,
Oh, good.
Donald Blinton or something like that. Yeah. I thought if this guy would have been in season 1, I could
It'd
have
been
seen it
fine.
happening and
Yeah.
it would have been fine. But yeah, it was kind of miraculous that Game of Thrones didn't have that many recasts. But simultaneously, we also have to remember this was the thing to be in at that time,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like,
I mean, Ed Sheeran couldn't wait.
yeah, could not wait and had to sing for Arya and all the Lannister soldiers, and everyone thought, "Why are you here?" But, um, it people would have worked around their schedules for the most part to ensure that they were not missing out on their role in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I mean the budget of that. I mean, it was unheard of. I mean, it didn't just change fantasy television; it changed
Yeah,
television. I
it
mean,
changed television, exactly.
and that's why. And this is one of those takes that is shouted down a lot. Is like I still think it's a great television show. I
A
think that
lot of
there's
it
flaws,
is.
but you could argue that some of the best moments ever in television history are part of it. And
Mhm.
it wasn't perfect, but
No,
I
wasn't.
watch it and I do not. I've heard people say, they can't, and I get it, but that's not me. Yeah,
That's me.
I mean, there's a lot of people I know. Now, here's a funny thing. I've said this on Chat with Nuts before, but I know people who are not in the internet zeitgeist at all. Normal people.
Non-book-reading
They
people.
had, and not even that, but they're not on Twitter.
Yeah,
They don't talk about this stuff online. They go to work and talk about maybe, and
sure.
a lot of them liked season 8.
Yeah.
And it was a shock to me when I started talking to
Mhm.
these people.
Yep.
And by the way, Game of Thrones was still in the top 10 stream shows. I think it was top 5 stream shows all the way into 2021. And
Yeah.
I imagine it was probably in 2022, but that's when I saw it.
Yeah.
And I had people coming to me and be like, "Hey, you read fantasy books, right? I watched Game of Thrones finally." My in-laws were part of it. And I said, "What'd you think of the season 8?" And they said, "It wasn't as good as the other ones, but it was all right."
Yeah.
They said, "I really liked the big battle at the end, and then this, that." They said, "It wasn't great. Like, you could kinda tell it was coming to an end, but, like, they didn't like, it wasn't like, how it was, like, the
Yeah.
vitriol, like, I hope they die," just, like, awful shit.
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's interesting.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, and we are not who they want to appeal to. They want to appeal to my in-laws. They want to
Mhm.
appeal to my coworker who doesn't know that fancy books are that, you know what I mean? Like they
Yeah.
want those people because that's what captures the audiences,
Right.
right?
Well, that's the mass audience.
Yeah.
And before I fully answer that, I watched season 2 and did recaps for every episode on my channel. You're welcome if you're so inclined.
It does seem that like, Wheel of Time show isn't super popular in our circles, but
Yeah.
Amazon seems to love it. I mean, they've done their season 3 is coming, season 4 is already greenlit, though that can
Yeah.
always change. But like,
Yes.
I think that show is probably more successful than people think it is.
I
Possibly,
think it
I might
is,
be wrong too.
honestly.
By the way, I might be wrong.
It's no Rings of Power in the sense that I feel people stick with Wheel of Time more than they did with Rings of Power. But what Wheel of Time has done really well is their casting for villains and their writing for villains has been excellent. So that's been, for me, the only real positive experience of watching Wheel of Time. But with season 8, I definitely agree with people that aren't as typically people who aren't fantasy readers and are really into those big Marvel type moments and events really were on board with season 8. And that was really apparent for me with the Night King scene with Arya
Mhm.
and Melisandre telling her that line of, I told you you were going to close all these eyes, and blue eyes is one of them. Ah, and her having her girl boss moment. And I, in that moment, was like, nope. I was really upset about that moment. But then we were watching it with our neighbors at the time who don't read fantasy, and they were super on board with it
Mm.
and were really happy with it. And I was like, this is going to be a problem for us watching this show with you guys every week, because clearly I am going to have very strong feelings that other people are not going to to agree with.
Well, and you have to remember that you're living in a totally different experience because you read the book so many times. I
Yeah.
mean that is a very different thing. And I think it's easy to get them mixed up. I was able to kind of, you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
split them.
Separate it.
Yeah, I was to say Lost is very similar, but yeah, also I will say nobody really ever likes endings until later. Breaking Bad, I remember that night I went on Twitter and stuff. People were like, "Breaking Bad ending sucked," and now it's considered one of the most well executed endings of all time. The Sopranos ending is also like this.
Here's a fun story. Okay. So when Game of Thrones was getting ready to launch its last season, I think it was in Entertainment Weekly that D&D gave an interview about the last season. And I grew up on The Sopranos. My father showed me inappropriate television from a very young age. And The Sopranos was one of those like immediate things that I was like 7 or 8. And he was like, we should watch this together. And we did. So when we watched the finale, I remember being highly disappointed with the finale of that show.
I love
And when this article came out in Entertainment Weekly, D&D were like, we loved the ending of The Sopranos. And I looked at my husband, I was like, oh no. That was my immediate warning sign that I knew I wasn't going to like it.
I love the ending of Sopranos. I think it's fantastic. When it aired, the creator didn't even want to roll credits. He didn't want to do any of it. And they got calls to cancel HBO, and like my it went out at the last. I love it. It's such a creative way of doing it.
But you don't like endings, right? Like typically you said
I don't care. I don't care that much about endings.
Yeah.
I don't need a phenomenal pay it all off kind of thing.
Sure.
It is what it is. I see Britton saying, calling you out, Jimmy. I never heard of anyone. I'm telling you, the night Breaking Bad ended, the internet at that time, that day, people did not like it. I remember specifically arguing with people on Facebook about it because that was back when I still argued with people on the internet. But my point is that when you're watching something in real time, like season 8 felt like such a colossal disappointment. But if you only spend 4 weeks binging the show, it's probably a lot easier to go, it was all right. Move on.
Definitely.
Move on.
As opposed to someone w's been watching it from the premiere.
For 10 years.
Exactly. Or hi, my cat's trying to rub
also
my...
mob everyone is influenced by a mob. That is facts.
Oh, yeah.
Like it just is, whether it's a hype train or a hate train, like people just, it's part of human nature, and then we pile on, and then people feed into that energy, and it is like kind of invigorating, like to be like part of that. It can
be to be part of the general consensus and opinion.
I got married that weekend, so I watched it in my hotel room, and I had other things to do, so I watched the season 8 finale, and I remember disliking some parts, and I remember liking some parts, and I had no idea until I got back home a little bit later in the week, and I was like seeing what people thought, and that's where I realized that people hated every single second of the last episode, and I was like, oh, interesting. Because like, and I watched it with a couple of my friends who are all different ranges of interested in it.
Sure.
And we all kind of came to the same conclusions about certain scenes that we love. I wouldn't even say love. Well, maybe there's parts I did love.
Okay.
And then parts
what are they? I gotta know. What are they?
Oh, this is the most unpopular opinion I have in the world, because I just think it's a phenomenal scene, and that's Daenerys and Jon. Everybody hates it, but I think the scene itself is phenomenal. I love the way
I think there are aspects of that scene that are really interesting, right? We see in that, well, we kind of know beforehand that it's not snow in her vision from the House of the Undying, that it's ash. So that's kind of cool that we get that full circle moment in the throne room. But I didn't hate the conversation between the two of them. Like, you kind of knew if you were paying attention. You were like, we see where this is going.
Yes. Now everything that happened after.
Yeah, not good.
All the way until the very ending, I did not like.
No.
so
that is good.
I'm not sitting here saying that I loved it, but there were moments that did affect me, like emotionally, and I enjoyed. So that was just one of those things, and then I started reading things on, and I'm like, I fucking hate this. I hate this shit. And then, and I rewatched it, and I was like, no, I still think I like that. Well, actually. And then then you question everything. You're just like, how much are people influencing me? About this. And then one of my friends, same age as me, not on the internet, and he's like, yeah, I thought season 8 was sick. And he watches a lot of television. And I was just like flabbergasted. And that was that was my first like eye-opening experience where I was like, the internet is a weird thing. Like it is a
very weird thing. There were a couple of cinematic elements of season 8 that I thought were some of the best of the whole series. The charge at the battle at Winterfell is chef's kiss perfection. It's the stupidest idea of all time, but
Yeah.
visually it's stunning.
Yeah, it's
And
beautiful.
in that finale episode, when Drogon wings flap behind Daenerys as she's standing there, it's a 10 out of 10 visual. Like, it's just perfect. But then you think of the plot and you're like, not so much.
The connective
So,
tissue was missing. There was a lot of
yeah.
connective tissue missing, and then the pacing. I mean, it's clear, like as day, and I think a lot of those things are a bit hard to even argue against because there's plot holes and character change and all that stuff. But I was still able to find things I enjoyed about it, and I think maybe the reason might be is because I always held the books above the show, whereas I don't remember if you remember the dialogue when the show was on. People were like, "This is better than the books." I remember that all the time, people saying that, and I'm like, stop it.
No.
Stop it. The books are kind of boring. Shut up.
No. First of all, the dialogue of the first season is almost verbatim from the book. So,
Yeah.
and then this was an interesting thing when season 8 was about to come out. My husband and I did a rewatch of the whole series with said neighbors who ended up liking a lot of season 8. And when prior to season 8 coming out, my ranking of the seasons were probably that I liked season 6 best. I really liked season 6, season 1, season 3, season 4, season 5, season 2. I had a lot of issues with season 2 when it came out initially. And for me, it was because in my mind, it deviated significantly from the book. And then on the rewatch, I was like, it's closer than I remembered. And there's more dialogue from the book than I remembered. I was just really upset with the way that they changed aspects about Jon and Daenerys's storylines, and that we didn't get the exact visual from House of the Undying, because that for me, and that is one of the standout scenes for me in the whole series. And I remember when I read it thinking, I cannot wait to see this and what they're going to do with this. And then they were like, no, we're good. So I was like, cool. It's upsetting, but yeah, it changed though after we got to season 8. That ranking significantly changed.
Yeah, I mean, it is it's a tough thing to tell a completely perfect story. And I don't know. I have very fond memories of it. And we talked about, like, you interacting with your grandma and stuff like that is something that I don't know if I'll ever have again.
Yeah.
I get it on here on BookTube, which is fantastic, but like
Sure.
I really don't know if I'll have that again for like a
Yeah.
television show or something. And part of that is because I've been exposed to so much more already. But we are now in a position where there are so many streaming services and fantasy has shown up. Like Wheel of Time season 1 did numbers for Amazon. It really did. It was one of their most successful shows as far as season 1 went. And the fact that these properties are proving to have people like us that can kind of kick it off, it really still relies on the general public. But Murderbot just got announced by Martha Wells.
I saw that today. Yeah.
There's a Foundation TV show on Apple that doesn't follow the books really at all, but is very successful. We get all these things. Shadow and Bone, it got canceled. Witcher, it sucks now. But like, there's a lot of stuff. And today, it's very preliminary, but Tad Williams' Otherland is going to be made into or attempted to be made into a television show. And I actually think that's going to be interesting, because I'm only read the first 2 books and I wasn't super high on book 2, but what it is addressing, the themes are so relevant to today with AI and virtual reality, all this stuff, that I think the show actually has an opportunity to revive a conversation around that series. I don't know if there was ever a conversation around that series, but I remember Erickson saying this, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not super big. I don't really care when things deviate from the source material, as long as it's done well. I don't necessarily care. And Erickson was talking about how he encourages in the future, like if Melasma was made in 100 years, that he would encourage them to change things to make it more about like what the time is and this and that. And I'm stating this very clumsily. He said it beautifully, but in a way it breathes life and keeps the story alive, and it doesn't fall dead because of how things have changed. And I thought that I don't know, that struck a chord with me, and I've just never been super concerned with like the fidelity to the source material. So,
Yeah,
for instance,
I
Otherland would be great if they made changes. Like,
sure.
there's a lot of changes that could be made.
I feel like for me, it depends on what specifically they are changing, because I am all for adapting it if it makes sense, or modifying it if it makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I loathed the American Gods adaptation, but people, if they're familiar with my channel, know that I love the book very deeply, and I love Neil Gaiman. He's like shares a large space of my heart. And one of the characters when the book was written was a character named Technical Boy, who was classified as that kind of early 2000s computer type geek. And by the time that the show was adapted, technology had advanced so much that it wouldn't have made sense to adapt him in that way. So they modified it. And I was like, that's smart because it's reflecting what we would expect. So when it's stuff like that, I'm completely on board for it. And I'm like, they should do that.
Yeah.
Or if you know that something maybe hasn't aged well in a way that when it was written, it was maybe more acceptable, but it's not as acceptable now, like go for it, change it. Or if it enriches your story in a new, cool way, fine with me. But when you're changing fundamentals of characters, that's more so where I struggle. Like
Hmm.
in Game of Thrones specifically, how they ended with Jaime for me was a major issue because I'm like, we're trending upwards this whole time, and then it's a very steep peak into despair.
I that's another thing that I enjoyed actually in season 8, and that's not very popular either. But I kind of encourage. I almost feel like sometimes it would be better for them to completely deviate from source material,
Sometimes.
or be almost unrecognizable. And a
Yeah.
really good example of this is Philip K. Dick,
Mm.
Blade Runner, Do
Yeah.
Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and the Man in the High Castle. These shows, why, and there are some dickheads out there. I love that. That are very not big fans of the adaptations, but
Sure.
Blade Runner the movie is beloved,
Yeah, it's
and
great.
it is completely different than the source material.
Hmm.
So in those regards, like sometimes I almost feel like you'd be better off going further away rather than trying to play this like cat and mouse game. And
Yeah.
I've seen people say this who love Wheel of Time, who love the books and actually do love the show. They say, if they just quit trying to do this thing back and forth, just be your own
Yeah.
wheel, like the spinning of the wheel. It's a whole new thing. It's
Hmm.
another rotation. Just do that.
I'm of that opinion, honestly. But I'm also not as attached to Wheel of Time as other people are.
Yeah.
I only read the first 3 books, and I read it basically to watch the show and compare it. But for me, when I was watching it, I was like, they should have called this The Tower rather than Wheel of Time, because they're doing such an excellent job at portraying the Aes Sedai and the storylines within the Tower that if you wanted to focus your whole story on this, that would be fine. And I think that the
Mhm.
majority of the fan base would have been on board with that. But you anger people when you stick to a name and you call it an adaptation and then you change so much. But one of my favorite shows of all time is The Last Kingdom, which is based on the
Yeah.
Bernard Cornwell Saxon Chronicles series, where they changed a good amount and or condensed storylines and enhanced certain characters. And I was like, I'm here for it because it worked better in that medium. Like, not everything is going to translate well from page to screen. And that's just the reality that the written word sometimes wasn't intended to be adapted to television.
Yeah.
But you can do it in a way that your audience doesn't feel betrayed by the source material and or feels like they're gaining a new experience, and that's a really fun thing to be a part of. And I felt that way with Last Kingdom and I loved it. So, yeah, I definitely think it can be done. I just don't think we see many positive outcomes with that happening.
I mean, Dark Stain has a good point though. Jurassic Park is wildly different from the book, as is
Oh
Forrest
yeah.
Gump. I mean, these are some of the Blade Runner. I mean, these are some
Love.
of the these are some of the biggest box office things, and they don't have much fidelity when it comes to
Yeah.
the source material. So I just think it's interesting. I think that's why I keep an open mind. There's a lot of people, as soon as something changes, they're like, this sucks. And I just don't feel like that's a fair way of doing it, because there's a lot of different ways to adapt material. Now, here's the hottest take I have is I don't really care about adaptations that much. I like books. I
Yeah.
like books more than I like TV by a large margin. Like for instance, you would think I would watch all of Rings of Power or all of the Wheel of Time show just because it's fantasy and like there
Yeah.
are things I like about those things. And I just couldn't care less. Like I really couldn't. I mean, House of the Dragon, I'm here for
Mhm.
because I mean it's my thing.
Yeah.
But like largely, like, I don't know. People are like, dude, when's First Law getting made? And I'm like, I don't know. And I don't know if I want it to be, because
Yeah.
once it's made, it's part of the conversation.
It's out there. Yeah.
You talk about the Shannara, you're going to get talked about the TV show. It happens every
Mhm.
time. Game of Thrones, if I
Yep.
wear my A Song of Ice and Fire Adidas shoes, hey, season 8, bro.
Do
Season 8,
you
bro.
have a Song of Ice and Fire Adidas shoes?
I have all of them. I have I have every single pair. I have
And
the
which one is
Starks.
the best pair?
The Targaryens are sick, but honestly, the White Walkers, they're like white with this really light blue tint on the side. They're all ultra
Nice.
boost. I mean, all of them look good. The only ones that aren't great are the Night's Watch ones, because they kind of look like just a general sneaker in a lot of
It's
ways.
like an
But
all black sneaker.
it's black with a white heel, which I hate.
Yeah, I don't love that.
Now the Stark ones are cool. They're gray.
Mm,
I thought about making a video of it, all the Game of Thrones adjacent things I own, but I'm
you
kind of embarrassed.
should.
I'm embarraessed by it.
I mean, you might wanna be, but that's fine.
I
Like,
have an entire
own it.
cabinet full of just dumb things.
Yes, Daniel, I know that they're starting with Best Served Cold, which I think is an odd one to start with personally,
I think
but
it's a great one to start with, but I
I
think
get it though. That's the thing, I get it, but I wish we're starting with Blade itself,
I
personally.
think Abercrombie most likely knew that that was the best way to go, because it's fast paced. It
Yeah.
has a lot of what First Law is, but in a manner where I think getting it to the screen should be fairly easy. I've seen some people say, well, it ruins the idea of First Law trilogy. I don't think that's true at all.
No, it doesn't.
And,
No.
and honestly, on screen, Best Served Cold might be a better story than First Law trilogy. First Law trilogy is a great book, a
It
great
is.
series, but a lot of the internal dialogue is what's driving
Yeah.
that story along. Whereas Best Served Cold, there's a lot of external action.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's going to be good. And Abercrombie worked in television, and he's working with them on it. Like he is a part of the process.
He's
I think
heavily involved, and I believe he's written the screenplay.
this
So I
is
feel much
big.
more confident with that than not.
This is going to be big. I think at the very least, it'll be something people enjoy. At worst, it's a flop.
Yeah.
At best, this kicks off a First Law movie franchise, which is
Oh,
crazy to think about. I
I'm
mean,
here for it. But it's true when you think about it. I had not really thought about it in the context of which you said Glockta's stuff is primarily dialogue, like inner
yeah,
dialogue.
yeah.
So yeah, I had not thought about it in that way, just because when I think of Glockta, my heart sings and I go, I would love more Glockta in the world. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? But it's true. It's definitely his internalized thought.
It is. I mean, that's just kind of how that series makes its mark on you in a lot of ways. Now, Age of Madness has enough there from the get-go that I think those are meant to be on screen. I would not be surprised if he wrote them with that intention as well. I am excited for Best Served Cold. It's not that I hate adaptations or I don't like, or I won't watch them or anything, but I just,
Yeah.
I don't know. I always say, man, Realm of the Elderlings, let's do it. And I'm like, I like them as books. Like books are
And that's
better.
fine.
I
That's
feel like TV is ranked higher, or movies are ranked higher than books to people. The
well,
people
they
who
are.
read. And I'm just like, guys, we're readers. Let's read them.
I don't know why that is, but I wonder if that's a generational thing, because we are of that generation where we grew up having television and books simultaneously, and that was available to us. Whereas our parents' generation maybe didn't have that option, and it's different for them.
And this.
But Exactly.
There's
You
Lucy.
know? Exactly. And yes, we are still talking. It's been 2 hours and 23 minutes, and we have been talking a long time. So but it's been a delightful conversation so far, so I'm fine with it.
Yeah, for the 10 people who've understood all of the Song of Ice and Fire references, I appreciate you.
We've appreciated you very much for being here. But yeah, no, I'm excited for First Law if it wants to get made. I always feel more confident when the author is involved. That for me
Yeah.
is a sign of just confidence going into it. Like for me, my favorite adaptation is probably Good Omens. And
Hmm.
it was because Neil Gaiman wrote the scripts. And also the casting for that show was 10 out of 10 perfection. Anytime David Tennant and Michael Sheen are in something, I'm going to be there and I'm going to love it. So we actually saw Neil Gaiman live years ago and they had just finished filming the first season of Good Omens. And he was like, as a gift to all of you for coming out, I'm going to read a few scenes that didn't quite make the cut into the show. And I looked to my husband after he read those scenes and said, if that's what didn't make it in, we're golden. Like this is going to be absolute just phenomenal TV. And I was right. It was so good. And I loved every second of the first season. And I thought the second season was possibly even better. And it just got
Wow.
confirmed for a third season today, a third and final season. And I'm jazzed. I'm super
That's
excited.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've only heard good things about the Good Omens TV show.
You should watch it. It's great. So I will ask you one last question. And it's going to be this one because we're talking about it. Any fun casting that you'd want for First Law?
I only have one because I don't do fan castings really. I always just make a joke of make everyone Henry Cavill. But the only thing I want that is required, and this is not headcanon for anyone else other than me probably, but I want Baez to be played by the guy who played Varys in Game of Thrones.
Only Phil?
And I literally just want him to show up and talk the exact same way and just look like Varys, but he's Baez. That's it. That's all I want.
I am not upset with that casting. I think that's a good choice. Everyone that I kept seeing kept going for Graham McTavish for Baez, and I think I like yours better.
I just, I have a very limited imagination. So like that's as far as I could get. Can we throw Joaquin Phoenix in there somewhere? Like, can he be somebody?
I'm not quite sure who he'd be.
I don't know. Make him Dog Man. I don't care. Like, just make him somebody.
The only real casting I would like to see, and I believe his name is Sam Claflin. I think he would be a great Glocta.
I think I've had people show me that picture before, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah, he's skinny and frail enough looking, but also could look pretty enough that at one point you would assume that he might have been good looking. So I feel like that would work well for Glocta, but that tends to be the gist of my fan casting for that show.
I want Glocta to be Ben Stiller. And Vince Vaughn as the Black Dow.
I don't hate that.
Mean,
yeah, I mean that would probably be pretty funny. But I kind of hope that they do what Game of Thrones did and that they go with majority unknown actors. That's usually my hope for these things. I like giving actors a good start in this type of thing.
Whoever does the HBO pipeline is just a amazing person at that job.
Yeah.
Like House of Dragons also, I mean, has some stars just like Game of Thrones, but like some of the unknown people are just so good. It's crazy.
We thought initially when we were watching it, we were really sad when Millie Alcock left because we thought she was so good.
So good.
Yeah. And then I loved Emma Darcy. I thought they did a great job. And Olivia Cook, is that her name? Who plays Allison? So good. Like they were all really, really well cast. But Matt Smith for me was just
he's very polarizing. People hate him or love him.
Don't get it. I think he's my husband is of that ilk where he's like, no, he's not a Targaryen. And I'm like, well, you're wrong because he's great. And
I mean, not to be offensive, but he kind of looks inbred. I mean,
yeah,
like I think he looks like a Targaryen because
he looks like a perfect Targaryen. Exactly.
He's so distinct. Like he's very distinct. And that's why he works in The Crown as well. So,
which the final season of that comes out tomorrow, which I'm very excited to watch. Because I am there for a period drama. Any period drama, I'll basically watch
Listen, as
it.
long as Vince Vaughn is in First Law, that's all matters.
Well, thank you so much for coming to chat to me for almost
Of course.
2.5 hours. I feel like I could probably keep going, but I don't want to keep you on.
Well, we'll have to do it again.
Yes,
And
we'll have a
maybe I
part
won't
2.
spend 90% of the time just talking about obscure A Song of Ice and Fire references.
I'm fine with it. Honestly, we can make the whole next chat even more obscure. A Song of
Beautiful.
Ice and Fire chat. Thank you all for hanging out with us for the last 2.5 hours. If you're catching us on a rewatch, you should leave us a comment and let us know if you caught any of the obscure references that Jimmy was chatting about. But I assume if you follow me that you also follow Jimmy. But if not, Jimmy, can you please tell people where they can find you?
You can find me over at the Fantasy Network, which is my book channel. I've been doing mostly just wrap ups and chatting with nuts over there, but I am about to go through my year end awards, and then I'll do my top 10 books of the year, which is always really exciting, at least for me. And then I also run a I help run Stormlight podcast, which is Lost in Roshar. You can check that out wherever podcasts are available. And Bend the Knee is my A Song of Ice and Fire podcast I run with my good friend Sir Matt the Bud Knight. And I also have a manga channel. But like, you guys probably don't like manga, so don't worry about it. I do a lot.
Jimmy's a very busy guy, and he took time to come talk to me, so I greatly appreciate it. But thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in with us, and we will see you all next time. I think my next of these will probably be in the new year because I will have done 4 or 5 lives this week, and I feel like people are definitely going to be tired of seeing my face. So I think it's time for a short break. But thank you all. We will see you next time. Have a good night.